Hi everyone. Good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Before visiting the notary, Steve was visibly nervous, although he could not understand the real reason for his anxiety. The young orderly's heart began to beat like crazy at the mere thought that in a few minutes he would be read the will of a deceased patient who, for some inexplicable reason, had included him in her will. Did she really go for it after all? That's kind of weird. We never talked about it, Steve thought as he walked up the steps to the notary's office. He was in a bad mood. More than anything else, Steve was stressed about the situation itself. Where was he and where were the late millionaire's wills? What did he have to do with any of this? His job was a small one, working on the ward, helping sick patients, and there's no need for gratitude. Steve wasn't the kind of man to ask for money for his services. It's a job, and it's paid. To each his own. The notary was already waiting for him, and, glancing at the screen of his smartphone, said, "Have a seat, Steve. I've summoned you to read Smith Emma's will to you in strict secrecy." Steve looked into the notary's eyes with surprise. Secrecy? Are we playing spies here? Honestly, I don't get it at all. Is this some kind of joke? There was a tense silence in the office. Only the second hand of the wall clock was methodically counting the interval allotted for the conversation. The notary hesitated for a moment, but still answered his guest's question. "Steve, I certainly understand your surprise, but it was the late Emma who insisted on the conditions of secrecy, not me. So I suggest we get to the point." "Yes, of course, I don't mind," Steve agreed. The notary nodded and, putting on his horn-rimmed glasses, began. "According to Smith Emma's will, you receive a very sizable deposit in a bank opened in your name. I won't say the exact amount out loud, but I can write it down for you on a slip of paper." Steve's eyes widened in surprise. The notary smiled understandingly and then added, "But that's not all. Steve, after the announcement of the inheritance, you must perform one very delicate task." "What kind of task?" The notary didn't keep his client waiting and blurted out almost immediately. "You are to spend the night at the grave of the deceased Emma. Just a little item like this. The money is yours." "What, spend the night in a cemetery? Are you out of your mind? What kind of adventure is that? Is that really what it says in the will?" Steve couldn't help himself, and then he realized that the lawyer was innocent. And anyway, could he have supposed such a thing? Understanding the visitor's state of mind, the notary added, "According to the deceased's will, you are to report to the city cemetery no later than tomorrow. The details of the bank account are enclosed, and you'll receive them after you've fulfilled all the conditions. I must warn you, there is no way around the rules. You either strictly comply with them, or you don't. In the first case, you get a lot of money. In the second case, we part with you and, having shaken hands, safely forget about each other's existence. So it's up to you." Steve froze in amazement. What a piece of news. He'd been living his life without touching anyone. And then this happened. Why did this patient like him so much? To tell the truth, Steve didn't know what to say. It all sounded so strange, it took his breath away. A test of his abilities, a test of courage. But what normal person would spend the night in a graveyard? It was unthinkable. Steve's face immediately reflected everything he thought of as a perceptive man. The notary was able to read the signs better than other books in the past. Mr. Bierman worked in a court of law, where he occasionally encountered very interesting personalities, ranging from outright criminals to spouses filing for divorce. Deciding not to prolong the meeting, he summarized, "If there are no more questions, I dare not detain you, Steve." At the same time, the notary looked expressively into his guest's eyes, as if trying to hypnotize him and bend him to his will. Of course it was not so, and Mr. Bierman's characteristic look spoke of nothing wrong. Steve said a dry goodbye and left the office, which suddenly felt so cramped and stuffy. When he went outside, he enjoyed the fresh air and sat down on a nearby bench. The notary's words echoed in his head. A night in a cemetery. A night in the cemetery. A bank account. The condition voiced by the lawyer shocked the young orderly so much that he didn't know what to do next. Should he refuse the will? But he had done without large sums of money before, and nothing. But what about Dad? He's been wanting to save up for a power wheelchair for a long time. What if this is his chance? The thoughts swarmed in Steve's head like ants that couldn't stay still for a minute. His father was a trucker. Aiden had been in an accident caused by a driver who had drifted into the oncoming lane, and when he saw that the car was being driven by a woman with a teenager sitting next to her, He had swerved a steering wheel in the opposite direction. Although the collision was avoided, Aiden's multi-ton truck crashed into the ditch, trapping the unfortunate driver firmly in the cab. Fortunately, Steve's father was lucky and survived, but the injuries he sustained in the accident left him permanently confined to a wheelchair and unable to drive the truck, nor any other motorized transportation. That's when the dream of an electric wheelchair became Aiden's only goal in life. One day, he even saved up the necessary amount of money, but by a cruel irony of fate, he became a victim of fraudsters who robbed his apartment, pretending to be employees of the local management company. Steve then just returned from work and found his father crying over an empty jewelry box where he kept all his modest savings. Why? Why did they take the last of it from me? Am I guilty of something? I never took a dime of someone else's money in my life, and I put my son on his feet all by myself, his father said through his tears. Steve clenched his fists painfully, knowing perfectly well that there was no one to punish anyway. Deceived a trusting invalid, put his guard down, but it was really a pity for his father. He had been saving money for a long time, and now what? The light in his eyes faded, and depression set in with renewed vigor. But how can you not be sad? Steve's mother passed away a long time ago. He'd been 7 years old at the time, a hereditary disease that followed all the women in his family. There was very little that could be done. Chemotherapy sessions and expensive treatments were useless. Steve had been raised by his father ever since. Aiden was never able to get together with anyone else. After the accident, it was out of the question. What kind of family? Steve did his best to support his father. Recently, he started saving money again to buy him the very same electric wheelchair. But the prices were getting higher and higher. Adan himself became sick more often, which meant that part of the family budget was spent on medicines. To get out of this situation, Steve often took part-time jobs on the side for a small fee, helping those who needed it. But when he saw that a person could barely make ends meet, he did everything for free and flatly refused to charge anything for it. His partner in the department only laughed, calling him a wizard in a white coat. But Steve only joked, "What kind of wizard am I? I would be a wizard if I could get into medical school." But that's just not me. Everyone knew that Steve failed the entrance exams because he lacked only a few points. About the true cause of his fiasco, young orderly preferred not to spread.
In fact, Steve did not pass the exams by pure chance, deciding to help one applicant with the answer to a very difficult question. As it happened, it was the ticket he knew best. It was probably a mistake, because of helping another person he could not fully answer his own question. In order not to waste time, after failing the exams, Steve went to medical school, hoping to enter the university the next year.
But life had its own way, and after Aiden was in a car accident, the dreams of higher education were in the past for Steve. The work of an orderly in the surgical department was difficult, and not everyone could withstand it for more than 6 months. Potential low-level workers needed to have a strong psyche, not bad physical shape, as well as possess a set of necessary medical knowledge. Steve had all this in abundance, although he himself had dreamed of becoming a doctor since childhood. True, not a surgeon, but a therapist. But what difference does it make now? For some inexplicable reason, the head of the department disliked Steve at first sight and emphasized it in every possible way, both in conversation and at the meeting. The orderly himself tried to behave with emphasized politeness and never interrupted. Most likely, there was something in him that could be felt even at a distance, and the experienced chief immediately realized that Steve is too willful to devote him to all the secrets of the department. And this good in surgery was enough with plenty, and was primarily associated with paid wards, which the head of the department organized with the approval of the management of the clinic. Steve himself never divided patients into poor or rich. For him, they were all equal. An infirm grandmother, living from pension to pension, or a millionaire whose money cannot spend 100 years. But his partner Nikki behaved quite differently. With an experienced eye, he immediately assessed patients depending on the thickness of their wallet. Machine marked for himself those who should be served in the first place. Nikki made it clear to the other patients that they would have to wait a long time for his help. That was until Emma Smith came into the surgery department. She looked about 60 years old, although no one could say more accurately, because the protracted disease has changed the person beyond recognition. For this reason, not everyone could determine the age of the patient. Emma arrived with the ambulance crew on a late July evening. No motorcade or personal security. According to her modest behavior, the medical staff of the ward immediately referred her to ordinary citizens, i.e., those who could not enter the paid wards. Emma herself behaved modestly, not showing her wealth in any way. Since the woman felt ill at home, she was brought to the ward in a house robe and slippers. Seeing her, Nikki grinned contemptuously and hurried to one of the wealthier patients, who had been feeding him tips for some time now. Steve, on the other hand, didn't hesitate and, approaching the patient, helped transport her to the room. After that, he sorted out the bed and brought fresh linens. All this the orderly did quickly and professionally, almost in the same breath. "Thank you. You're a very nice man," the patient mumbled and smiled. Steve nodded and asked her to talk less to keep up her energy. After thinking for a moment, he added, "You're welcome. I mean, it's my job, especially since I know how hard it is for sick people. I have a wheelchair-bound father myself." Emma looked at the young orderly with undisguised respect. At the time, no one realized that she was actually an influential businesswoman with a knack for understanding people like no one else. Once in the hospital, Emma decided to pretend to be an ordinary patient in order to evaluate the quality of treatment and understand how it was so different from the one for which you have to pay money. Frankly speaking, Emma knew very well that the disease was incurable. She had been told that a long time ago. In fact, given far less time than she had lived since the final diagnosis, Emma Smith had always considered herself a fighter, never gave up, fighting to the last, looking for new methods of treatment and prescribing scarce and sometimes even experimental drugs. Another in her place would have just dropped his hands and sadly lived out his last days. But she did not. She hoped that she could defeat her disease. All this turned out much later, when the influential businesswoman realized that if she continues to behave like this, then adequate treatment in this clinic, she simply will not wait. To begin with, she summoned the head of the department, who entered the room with a haughty look and looked at the patient with a challenge. "Did you want something?" he asked. "Yes, I did," she replied. "My name is Emma Smith. You may have heard of me. Several car dealerships in the city and a large hypermarket downtown. And that's not all of my business infrastructure." The head of the department turned pale. Aidan had always considered himself a prudent man. But how had he made such a mistake with this patient? Normally, he would make inquiries about patients beforehand so that he would know what to expect from them in the future. This one was a mistake. "What do you want, Emma?" The superintendent asked as gently as possible. What do I want? I want all patients to be treated in the same conditions. I understand your surprise, and I will add, I am ready to pay for it. That is, I want all the rooms in this ward to get rid of the prefix VIP and become equally good for everyone, regardless of their position. Is this possible? The head of the ward was breathless with surprise. Yes, it's possible, of course, but it will cost you a lot of money and take some time. Emma smiled. I don't have any time, so you'd better hurry up, sir. I'll send my manager to you and he'll take care of all the financial matters. I'll give you 24 hours to solve this problem. And if you can't do it in 24 hours, I'll call the ministry. And then I'll tell the head doctor that you're not in the position you should be in. Do you understand me? Or do you need to switch to French? Yes, of course, I understand, said the head of SAND. At that moment, he felt like a simple orderly who was being told off by the chief physician. Steve watched with attention and mentally thanked Emma that she was not afraid of the influential doctor of the clinic. But his partner Nikki realized too late the mistake of trying to find an approach to the influential patient. He constantly suffered one failure after another, and for this businesswoman had a very good reason. To Nikki's dismay, she remembered too well his reaction on the day of admission and was not going to forgive such an attitude not only to herself, but to all other patients in general. With Steve, Emma talked at length on various topics, feeling a strong sympathy for the nice, kind guy. Tell me, do you have a fiancé? Forgive me for my curiosity, but you are such a good man that it makes my heart ache when you think that you might be alone. Steve looked away embarrassed. To tell the truth, he didn't feel comfortable talking about it. On the other hand, he didn't want to upset his patient and answered as he saw fit. Yes, there was a fiancé, Emma, but then we broke up. Vanessa's father runs a private clinic. He makes good money, and it's a big job. I'm just a regular orderly. When he found out his daughter met me, he drove a wedge between us. He found Vanessa fiancés in his own clinic. You know, someone with a lot of money. What about me? I don't even have my own car. I ride my bike to work. Emma smiled. So that's your wealth. It lies in your kindness, in your good attitude, and the fact that you don't have a car. You'll only be healthier. A bicycle, is a good thing. I used to ride it a lot when I was young. But now, as you can see, I'm sick. It's no use anymore, said the patient. Steve looked at her gratefully. She could cheer him up. Even though she was richer, he himself had never realized that wealthy people could be so kind to others. Thanks to Emma's funding, all the rooms in the ward were equipped with a TV and all the necessary amenities that had previously been available only in the VIP ward. Of course, it didn't happen all at once, but the bulk of it was done in the first few days. From then on, Steve and Emma became friends, as they both loved books and often exchanged opinions on what they had read, discussing favorite authors. The most interesting thing was that Steve had never once seen any of Emma's relatives come to visit. He'd seen the business manager in her room a couple of times, and a courier who brought some business papers right here, and no one else. Is she so lonely that there's no one to visit her at all? Puzzled the orderly. All Steve's attempts to inquire about it were to no avail, for at the mere hint of her family, Emma shut up and turned the conversation in another direction. One said that her children were long gone. Another said that she was a lonely widow and didn't know where to put her money. Rumors abounded. Each of the medical staff thought differently, trying to get to the truth. But the bottom line was that Emma was just a good and kind person who thought not only about herself, but also about others. She also had no patience for insolence and lies, which she had hated since childhood. A month ago, Emma passed away. It was Steve's day off that day. His father was sick again and needed help. Emma had a premonition of her passing and insisted on coming over to see her closer to lunch. Steve promised, but he couldn't keep his word. As luck would have it, Aiden had gotten so sick that he'd had to stay with his father until the evening. When he finally got to the station, he found out Emma was gone. How? I just saw her this morning during shift change, Steve whispered and clutched his head. Nikki shrugged indifferently. How's that? It was time, so she left. You knew about her illness. Yes, she understood everything, of course. Steve's eyes became moist, and tears made the boy's mind refuse to believe everything that had happened. No, it wasn't true. She couldn't leave. Just like that, without a word. Though what words could there be? For about a week after the funeral, Steve's conscience racked his soul. What had Emma wanted to tell him before she left? What had troubled her so much that she wanted to meet him in her final hour? Or maybe it was all just a coincidence. Well, there are such ordinary coincidences. He never got the answers to his questions, of course, and now the will. That Emma was a strange woman when she was alive, and when she died, she was a mystery. No, I'm not going to that cemetery. Let the money stay in the bank. She probably has some other relatives, distant or close. It doesn't matter. Here, let them take it, Steve thought. Steve whispered confidently. I don't want anyone else's. He stood up from the bench. The realization that he was right made him feel much stronger. Steve hurried home. He dismissed any thought of spending the night in the cemetery. No, he wasn't afraid of the dead. Not at all. But still, a cemetery was not the place to spend the night, not even for money. And a lot of money at that. But as soon as Steve opened the door of the house, he froze on the floor in an awkward pose. In the middle of the hallway lay his father. A little farther away stood an old wheelchair that appeared to have its wheels jammed again. What's wrong? Are you okay? Steve shouted and ran over. Aiden's breathing was practically audible. Steve touched his wrist out of fear and exhaled in relief. There was a pulse, albeit faint and indistinct, but there was still a pulse. Aiden's eyelashes fluttered. Then he slowly opened his eyes. You scared me, Dad. What are you doing on the floor? Careful, Steve asked. His father wrinkled his nose and asked for help getting up. His son gently took him under his arms and slowly moved him into the wheelchair. Here's the trouble. The wheel is stuck. Don't worry. The bearing went out again. So I lost my balance and fell to the floor. It's embarrassing. I'll tell you that. I fell on my back, so I couldn't roll over. I rolled over onto my stomach. I was exhausted, Aiden explained. At that moment, Steve felt another prick of conscience. He needed a new wheelchair. And the house should have been equipped with ramps a long time ago. But who needs it? That's right, no one but Steve and his father. Biting his lip painfully, he thought of Emma's will again. Should we go after all? But how long would it take? The house had been in need of repair for a long time. A wheelchair, again sanatorium resort treatment, clearly will not interfere. The man has only seen the sea in pictures. Even though he's a former trucker, and we have such health resorts in our country that they'll put anyone on his feet. Of course, Aiden had no idea what his son was thinking at that moment, and Steve was already in the cemetery, the same one where Emma was buried in one of the alleys. Why did she have to think of all this? But what could happen at night in a city cemetery? Looking longingly at his father's hunched figure, Steve found himself thinking that he would fulfill his patient's last wish. If that's what she wanted, let her have it at least in the other world. And how else, when this world is no longer bright? Deciding not to tell his family about it, Steve began to prepare for a night out to the cemetery. He charged a couple of flashlights with replaceable batteries, took out a warm jacket and sneakers with thick soles. You never know. It was summer, but the nights in August were not as hot as in July, and also had to cancel my work and postpone the day off. When my partner found out about it, he was offended for a long time. I'll have to take care of 2 people again. You know, the head of the department does not like it when there is only 1 orderly.
I know, but bear with me. I don't ask for this kind of thing very often. I'm trying to control myself, Steve replied.
Nikki thought for a moment, but then agreed. In fact, Steve replaced him in this way more than once and never prevented him from carrying out his plans. Naturally, he did not tell Nikki the truth and did not reveal the real reason for his absence. The whole next day Steve was as if on pins and needles. Every now and then, remembering what awaited him in the evening, he shuddered at the mere thought of the cemetery, because during the previous visit to the notary he had learned the number of the burial place he needed just in case. So he decided to realize his plan right after dinner, telling his father that he was going on night duty. Steve began the realization. In the rays of the setting sun, the city cemetery looked rather strange. Monuments of granite, marble, and concrete took on a completely different coloring than during the day. From the outside, they all seemed to glow from within, like memorial candles. Steve, mesmerized by the sight, stood at the massive gate that separated the realm of the dead from the world of the living. A little farther away was an old lady gate that looked like the hut of a kindly old man. The candle trembled with excitement in Steve's palm. A drop of sweat slowly trickled down his forehead. It was only evening. What was waiting for him at night? God, why had he gotten himself into this adventure? Steve staggered down the alley, trying to find Emma's grave. At that moment, the door of the gatehouse opened, and the lanky figure of the caretaker, a man in his 70s, wearing a cap with a broken visor and a cup of tea in his hand, appeared on the doorstep. The label of a disposable bag fluttered in the wind, like a miniature kite that had decided to escape from the half-empty cup. "Evening, man. Where are you going at night?" the watchman asked. Steve shuddered and looked at him guiltily. "I thought I'd check on a relative. She passed away a month ago." The caretaker took a couple of steps in the direction of the visitor and thought. He could not forbid him to come to the cemetery. It was not in his power, but it would be dark in an hour or 2, and it would be a very ungrateful thing to walk through a cemetery in pitch darkness. "Well, if it's so decided, I won't oppose it. I believe he's a good man. I'm sure you won't do anything stupid. I'm not mistaken, am I?" the caretaker asked in a quiet, pleasant voice. Steve smiled embarrassedly. "No, you're not wrong. It's just the way it's going to be. I'm sorry. I don't know your first name or middle name." "Dave, come in when you get back. I'll buy you a cup of tea, and if necessary, I'll call you a cab," the caretaker said, again quietly switching to you. Steve nodded and waved goodbye. The orderly's soul felt noticeably warmer. He would not be alone in the cemetery tonight after all. Of course, it wasn't much consolation, but it wasn't so bad. After about 10 minutes, Steve reached the right place. The grave mound looked quite fresh, as if it had been erected only yesterday, not a month ago. Due to the short time of burial, the monument had not yet been erected, and instead there was a large iron cross with a picture of the deceased. As he approached the grave, Steve bowed his head mournfully. "I'm sorry, Emma, I let you down. I said I'd talk to you, but I didn't show up. I'm sorry if you can," he whispered, looking at the photograph. Steve caught himself thinking that the admirer's lips were touched by a smile, slightly visible, but no less touching. That's how Steve remembered Emma, with whose appearance the surgery department was literally transformed before his eyes. And she knew she was terminally ill. And why did she go to a regular clinic? She could have gone to a private organization where care and service were much better. It was a mystery. Steve sat down on the bench next to the grave and thought, why did she organize all this? Was it to make him confess? Unlikely she wasn't a petty person, not at all. Then what was the clue? Where's the solution to this puzzle? 100 questions couldn't be answered quietly. It wasn't like that at all. And why did it have to be at night anyway? Why not during the day? Not in the morning? Not in the evening after all? There were so many questions that with all his desire he could not find answers to them. Meanwhile, dusk was slowly settling over the cemetery. Steve's heart beat uneasily. Despite the fact that the orderly was a materialist, the cemetery at night frightened him very much. A slightly noticeable shiver ran through the boy's body as he reached into his bag to pull out a flashlight. At that moment, Steve involuntarily shifted his gaze to the massive iron cross placed on Emma's grave. He didn't notice anything special at first, but then, looking closer, He almost jumped up on the bench in surprise. The cross glowed with a green, slightly visible light. Steve involuntarily made the sign of the cross and shook like an aspen leaf. This was it. Here we go. Or had he gone mad with fear? Or was something strange really going on in the cemetery? Steve froze on the bench with a deadening grip. A minute passed, then another, but nothing terrible was happening. On the contrary, somewhere in the bushes there was the crackling of crickets, which are known to sense danger and usually shut up if there is any. Steve took a closer look at the cross and, to his amazement, realized that the mysterious glow was emitted not by it, but by a strange substance, with which the construction had obviously been lubricated beforehand. The boy jumped up from the bench and walked around the grave, stopping at the back of the cross. Steve's assumptions were immediately confirmed. On the backside was a greenish arrow pointing to its base. Steve gingerly touched the arrow with his fingers, and in the same minute they turned a greenish color. Why, it's phosphorus, he thought. Is that why Emma recommended in her will that I come at night? Otherwise, I wouldn't have seen the clue. But where is that arrow pointing? Steve exclaimed, forgetting that he was in the middle of a city cemetery. Then, coming to his senses, he pressed his hand fearfully to his lips and mentally apologized to the inhabitants of the realm of the dead. Since the point of the arrow was aimed at the base of the cross, the guy knelt down and began to rake the ground in that place. In a couple of minutes, Steve dug out a small container, wrapped in transparent cellophane for greater safety. Oh boy, and Emma had come up with such a clever combination that it made my head spin. I can't believe she'd think of something like that. From the shock and excitement, Steve's body was shaking and sweat was beading on his forehead. Now that the orderly had found the dead woman's hiding place, he no longer saw the point in sitting in the cemetery in pitch darkness and could go home. I wonder what's in that container. Money, gold, securities, Steve thought on the way back. The keeper's lodge, which from afar looked like a lighthouse for stranded sailors, served as a landmark for him. Steve felt much better. It was an adventure to spend the night in the middle of a cemetery. Even a skeptic would believe in the existence of otherworldly forces, especially when there is a full moon shining overhead and not a single living soul around. But no sooner had Steve reached the gatehouse than he saw that something strange was going on inside. In the brightly lighted windows, the profile of the keeper was visible in minute detail. There's lanky figure rose from his chair and, staggering from side to side, took a couple of steps in the direction of the exit. What? Is he drunk or something? It doesn't look like it, though. He sounds like a decent guy. You can tell Steve thought ironically. He had already moved a good dozen meters away from the gatehouse when he heard a slightly audible voice behind him. Help, help, I'm suffocating. Steve turned around and saw that the door of the gatehouse had swung open and Joe was standing in the doorway, holding onto the door jamb with one hand and his throat with the other, wheezing like a wounded animal. The caretaker clutched his chest with both hands and collapsed onto the asphalt warmed by the day's sun. Steve didn't hesitate a second. He ran over and rolled the old man onto his back. Joe was clearly choking, and the cause was probably swelling of the larynx. It was very enlarged. But what caused the swelling? Allergies, a congenital disease. There was no time to think. Time was running out in minutes. Steve's first thought was to call an ambulance. But then, looking at the blue face of the caretaker, he realized he couldn't wait any longer. He was still a little shaken from the stress he'd been through. His throat felt as dry as if someone had poured sand down it. Needless to say, the ambulance paramedic was surprised to see that Steve had definitely saved the caretaker's life with his actions. Where'd you learn to do that, kid? That incision was masterful. You're not a surgeon, are you? Your face looks familiar to me, the paramedic asked. Steve shook his head negatively, then answered, No, I never went to medical school. I'm an orderly in the surgery department. I've seen it done a couple of times, so I had to put it into practice. The paramedic patted the boy respectfully on the shoulder. You did the right thing, didn't you? His grandfather was allergic to wasp venom. He decided to eat honey in his retirement. Those striped ones got him. If it hadn't been for you, the poor guy would have died of asphyxiation. He'd be dead now. Steve just waved his hand. You're welcome. It's the same thing we do as health workers, no matter how you look at it. But no sooner had he moved a couple of meters away from the old woman than the doctor called him again. Hey kid, I'm thinking. How did you get here in the first place? Maybe you need a ride to the city. You'll be with us all the way to work. Why beat your legs? Steve turned around. I came to see someone I know tonight. I didn't realize it was dark. I wouldn't mind a ride into town. Well, that's just great. It's a sin to refuse, so I'm all for it. And in 5 minutes, Steve was in the ambulance with the paramedic and Joe lying on the gurney. The guy's mood had improved considerably. In the bag there was a container, found thanks to the clue with phosphorus on the cross. But Steve decided to open it at home, deciding not to go to the ward, so as not to annoy Nikki with his appearance. Steve got off at the gate of the hospital yard and, zipping up his jacket, walked towards home. By this time his father was already asleep, and when he heard the sound of the door opening, he mumbled softly and covered his head with a blanket. The nights in August were cool enough, after all. Steve knew that as well as anyone, so he decided not to wake his father with the noise of the shower. The boy washed himself under the faucet, washing his head to cool his mind and put his thoughts in order. After that, he locked himself in his room, where he placed the container he had found in the cemetery on the table. To Steve's surprise, inside was a folded piece of paper and a small silver pendant on a chain. Turning the item toward the light, Steve noticed a slightly visible engraving on the back of it. It contained only one word: forever. That's odd. Usually they put different phrases, quotes, but at the very least names. But here it's just one word, Steve thought, and put the pendant away in his desk drawer. Then unfolded the sheet. From the first words he realized that the message was addressed to him, and it began with the following words. Dear Steve, if you are reading these lines now, it means that I am no longer alive. I'm sorry for that scene in the cemetery, where I forced you to spend some time in pitch darkness. I hope you got it right, and left the place immediately as you found my hiding place. You're probably thinking, crazy grandmother, she's playing charades, but I just turned 45. You see how illness changes people? Yesterday I was beautiful, and today I'm Baba Yaga. It so happens that in this life I couldn't trust anyone but you. Many years ago I made a serious mistake, but more about that later. Since I have no direct heirs, all my assets must go to my third cousins who are just waiting for me to die. Their people are already everywhere. In my business, my house, my immediate neighborhood. I cannot even trust a notary, because I am not sure of his honesty. For this reason, I leave myself an impressive amount of money in the bank. Dispose of it properly. Now let's get to the point. 20 years ago, I committed a crime. No, I didn't kill anyone. I killed myself when I gave my newborn daughter to an orphanage in a fit of depression. Don't judge me harshly. I know I was a naive fool who ran away from the provinces after a traveling construction worker. I got pregnant and he left me, and turned out to be the father of 4 children. But I still remember his gift, a locket with the inscription forever. The second one he had on the day he broke up. I took it from my failed fiancé. You might even consider it stolen. I don't care. A 45-year-old woman facing her death doesn't lie, does she? The inscription on his locket said together, "You're a smart boy. You'll know right away." Those who put the 2 lockets together will receive the phrase "together forever." Now for the most important part. I put my runaway boyfriend's locket in the bottom of the basket with my daughter. I never saw my baby girl again. I later married a criminal mastermind and inherited his assets, growing them into an empire, and I became queen without a moment's hesitation, except I couldn't find my daughter. Illness is my punishment, my karma, if you prefer. God sees everything and punishes those who do terrible things. And now my hour of reckoning has come. Save the letter. Steve, find my daughter. I don't spare any money. There's enough in there to last the rest of your life. Protect my daughter, no matter what it takes. You're young. You can do it. I'm leaving. Don't judge. Try to understand your mother. Sincerely, Emma Smith. Rereading this message over and over, Steve couldn't hold back the tears. God, what a cruel punishment. To be all alone on my deathbed, and no one to serve a glass of water. Though they will, of course, but for money the tears flowed down Steve's cheeks with utter indifference as he pictured the scenes of Emma's hard life, which had been a trying one. That night he could not sleep. He tossed and turned in bed until morning. Then he got up, washed his face, and brewed a cup of strong coffee. "Son, did you change your mind about working yesterday? Didn't you run to your fiancée?" Dad asked. Steve smiled. "No, what brides are there? I've had so much to do that my head is spinning." Aiden shook his head. "What a good son I've got, though. A sight to behold. A real groom for marriage." "Dad, we're going to buy you a new stroller the other day." "You know what? We're going to get you a new stroller," Steve said. "You know, the one you've been dreaming of with the power wheelchair," Steve announced. "What do you mean? A stroller?" "Well, it costs money, and there's something else to put together. And you can buy a used car, and the old stroller will survive. Just buy me a bearing. Unless you come up and take Berkutu off, it'll come in handy," said Aiden. But Steve only grinned. "No, Dad will buy a stroller." "That's right. Where'd we get that kind of money? You're not involved in crime, are you?" Aiden raised an eyebrow in surprise. Steve came over to his father and put his arm around his shoulders. No, there's no crime. Don't worry about the money. It'll all change soon. Aiden nodded and furtively brushed away a tear. In the meantime, Steve got ready and hurried to work. He slipped the locket into his pocket and closed the door behind him. Emma's confession had touched him to the core. All the way to the hospital building, Steve could think of nothing but the story of the missing businesswoman. Who was she? Was she alive now? Or maybe long since married? But as soon as Steve crossed the threshold of the surgical ward, Nikki immediately rushed towards him. What kind of people don't have guards? Oh, come on, Steve. Where'd you find that, Uncle? You got 3 of them in there, and you got him so good at it. What are you, a surgeon or something? The whole clinic's on fire. Steve Smith operated on his grandfather's share of the cemetery. That's a great plot for a thriller, don't you think? Steve waved it off. Oh, come on. Nothing much happened there. But that's the way it is. The main thing is that you got help in time, and I don't need a better thank you. Nikki, surprised. Wow, you surprised me, Steve. You surprised me. It's the granddaughter of the old man came to check on him, along with his great-grandchildren, by the way. Just imagine triplets, 3 or 4 years old. She's a good-looking chick. I wouldn't mind playing romance with her, but my back hurts too much. I can't carry 3. Steve smiled. Nikki always had one thing on her mind. What an adventurer. Deciding to visit the cemetery caretaker on occasion, Steve changed into his uniform and cautiously opened the door of the room. From what the attendant saw before him, a cute smile played across his face. Around Joe's bed were a group of great-grandchildren, and sitting on a chair nearby was a pretty woman, about 25 or so. Seeing his savior, Grandpa waved his arms, though he couldn't say anything because of the cut. And you must be Steve. The paramedic told us all about it. Anyway, if it hadn't been for you, things could have ended much worse. My name is Emma, by the way. Emma Smith, Joe's granddaughter, said, and held out her tiny hand to the paramedic. It's a pleasure. You're welcome. It's my job, the guy smiled. At that moment, the door of the room opened, and the profile of an unshaven man with a distinctive wedge cap on his round head cut short. His shirt was wrinkled, his pants as worn as ever with oil stains around the knees, and his dirty shoes looked as if they had been walked across the Sahara Desert. Steve wrinkled his nose in displeasure and remarked in a low voice, "You can't go in here without booties." "What booties?" "Be thankful that I even came to this, and almost gave my soul to God at the workplace." "You should be buried at the cash register," the stranger muttered, casting an angry glance in Emma's direction. "Is it really the husband?" Steve's mind flashed. "No singing? All right. That's what you came for. And drunk, too." "Couldn't have done it without you," the woman blurted out. He, who was called Pete, grinned viciously, displaying a slender row of iron teeth. "You'll manage. You can't take a step without me." "That was your sick son. Now, old man, what am I? A walking ATM machine." Steve clenched his fists painfully, mentally praying to the heavens that this unpleasant man would shut up before he got a punch in the eye. But Pete wasn't going to calm down. Instead, he walked over to Emma and tried to grab her shoulder, causing the fabric to rattle alarmingly. "Pete, what are you doing?" "Let go. You're hurting me," she pleaded. Pete grinned viciously and was about to make a move, but Steve twisted him in a flash, pinning him against the wall. "You're tired of living. Or do you have an extra health reserve?" "You want to break my back," Pete howled, but Steve knew his business clearly. There was a reason his father had taught him self-defense himself when he was a kid. He pinned the villain's arm behind his back. "Well, you're not quite hungry, but very sad. You always want a sweet tooth." Emma was adopted at the age of 7 when Joe's daughter learned that after several failed pregnancies, she would not be able to have children. Putting his arm around Emma's shoulders, Steve involuntarily pulled her against him to comfort her. For so many years she had lived in ignorance, carefully guarding a silver pendant with the single inscription together, and only now, by fate, had she learned the secret of her origins, along with her own mother's name. Listening to Steve's confused story, Joe wept silently, still not believing in such coincidences. The next day, Steve and Emma went to the bank to withdraw some money to pay for little E.J.'s operation. Steve hadn't forgotten his word to his father either. Within a couple days, a brand new power wheelchair was already on the porch of Aiden's house. I still can't believe my eyes. Aiden circled the yard and couldn't contain his admiration for his son's gift. Holding Emma's hand, Steve headed for the gate as they had a lot of things to do together ahead of them. These included post-operative rehabilitation at a Black Sea resort for little EJ and buying a new house for Joe, who had been discharged from the hospital. After the cemetery incident, the elderly caretaker quit his job and devoted himself to raising his great-grandson. The financial issue was now resolved for many years to come. But the most important event in Joe's life was the wedding of Steve and Emma, who joined their hearts in marriage 7 months after meeting. The pensioner himself smiled slyly and regretfully hinted at the fact that the festive table is missing his favorite melon. After all, if it were not for it, there is no telling how this whole story would have ended. Kate had been in high spirits for days. Jake, whom they had been dating for 5 months, had proposed to her. The wedding was going to be a joyous affair. The only thing that saddened her all this time was that her parents had never lived to see that happy moment. Since birth, Kate was very much loved by her father and mother. The only and long-awaited child did not know anything to refuse. Her parents had a stable business, which had branches all over the country. Especially loved her father, who was ready to spoil his princess every day. And after prestigious school, Gregory, the girl's father, insisted that his daughter went to study at the best foreign college, where they often flew with his wife. Upon graduation, when she returned, in the first days of the happy parents gave her a luxury car and an apartment in the very center of the city. Then Gregory, at a celebratory dinner on the occasion of her return, said, "Well, my daughter, you are now a fully grown, independent lady. You have a great future ahead of you. Everything that your mother and I have earned in our lives will be yours alone. But one thing I beg of you, always approach everything with a clear head, especially in matters of love. Rich brides are always on the lookout, and do you know how many are after them? But don't be in a hurry to get married. Take a closer look at the one you're meant to marry. Check once again. The security service of our company is always at your disposal. At any time, we'll check all the background of the chosen one. Yes, and the marriage contract must necessarily conclude. Our brother can sometimes leave you without anything. God forbid you'll be left with nothing." Susan, the mother, looked at her husband in surprise that evening and said reproachfully, "Father, it's like you're saying goodbye to your daughter. You give such instructions, you and I will still have grandchildren to nurse. So let's think of good things. Look what goodies our Polly has prepared for Kate's arrival." Polly, who came from the village, had worked in the house for many years. She was in charge of everything, including cleaning, cooking, and household shopping. She knew the tastes of every member of the family and always tried to pamper them. She did her best for this dinner. She cooked everything Kate liked. At dinner, the family cheerfully discussed stories about student life, and none of those present could not even think that a week later in life will come a terrible grief. Kate was driving home from work that day. After returning home, her father had taken her into his office to run one of his business lines. Dad and Mom were on a business trip to inspect some branch office. They often flew around the facilities, and the father, even for these purposes, bought a personal airplane. She was already approaching the cottage village where they had a house. She heard her last name in the stream of information transmitted by radio. Turning up the volume, she hit the brakes and listened with her eyes wide open. The news anchor was saying something scary. She said that famous businessman, her parents, had crashed near the city. She went on to say something about a commission working at the scene of the tragedy and that there were no survivors. Hearing these words tore the girl's head, and without even realizing, she began to scream, "No, no, this can't be." How long Jessica stood on the curb sobbing, Kate didn't remember. She only woke up when the door at her side was opened by Gregory. It was the head of security for their organization. The retired colonel was always serious, even stern. And this minute, gently taking Kate's hand, he began to say, "Hold on. You can't change anything. You can't bring your parents back. You still have to live and live. Come on, my dear. I'll take you home. And my assistant will drive your car away." It turns out that Gregory, only hearing about the tragedy, sent to the scene of the accident and himself through a specially installed program, found Kate and rushed to not leave her with such grief alone. As he said later, "After a while, your father felt as if he felt that there was very little left to live. In the last days, he asked me especially often not to leave you if something happened to him. I also resented him for talking about death. Business was going well. There were no enemies. But you see how it turned out. After the death of her parents, Kate for some time did not live and existed. Everything was like a nightmare. It became a real agony for her to return to a completely empty house and spend her evenings alone. Polly, of course, continued to take care of everything, persuaded the mistress to accept the loss and live on. But she herself often went with tears in her eyes as soon as she came across a picture of the happy family home. At the times when everyone was still alive, Kate continued to commute to work. Only there she was somehow distracted from her sad thoughts. But everything changed one day. She stopped for lunch at her favorite restaurant, where she often visited with her father and mother, and when she was about to leave, she noticed a guy at the table across from her. He was looking at her, literally not taking his eyes off her. And when she got a half coat in the check room, a pleasant velvet voice sounded behind her. "Permission to court you. You are so beautiful, but your eyes are somehow filled with sadness." I couldn't help but approach. "Perhaps you need some help?" Kate wanted to dismiss the uninvited beau, but when she turned around, she saw blue eyes as blue as the sky, and she was stunned. She hadn't really gotten a good look at him in the hall or at the table. So here he had literally bewitched her with his charm. Jake, that was his name, walked her to the car with a pleading tone in his voice. "They say, Kate, we can't just break up like this forever. I can see you're feeling pretty bad right now. Let's meet back here tomorrow night. I can see that this restaurant is as dear to you as it is to me. I also have the kindest and most memorable days with it." And they began to meet. Kate began to feel interested in life again. Having learned about her tragedy, the young man surrounded her with increased attention and care. She felt happy for the first time in recent memory. Gregory, seeing such a clear change in the girl, once, after waiting for everyone to leave the office, said, "Kate, aren't you in love by any chance? May I ask what kind of prince has won your heart? Is he rich, or is he poor as a church mouse and only beats you for money?" But Kate, with only a sly smile, replied, "Gregory, stop patronizing me. I'm an adult, and is money what happiness is all about? He loves me, and I seem to love him, and that's probably more important than having a bank account. Let's make a deal. You will not interfere in my personal life. You're responsible for the safety of our firm. Take care of it, please." After she signaled that the conversation was over, she stared at her computer, and Gregory silently walked out. Meanwhile, Jake and Kate's stormy romance had reached the happy moment when the wedding was to take place. She and her friend had spent several hours choosing a dress, and after choosing the finest lace one that fit perfectly, they sighed with relief and went to their favorite coffee shop. There they spent the same amount of time discussing some subtleties of the upcoming celebration, and Kate at that moment suddenly noticed that her friend was not telling her something. She was mentally as if she were somewhere far away. And Kate, unable to bear it, asked, "Amber, is it just me, or is this something you want to tell me? I know you too well, don't I? Just say it already." Her friend, after a moment's silence, suddenly said in one breath, "You know, I've noticed Jake a few times when you weren't looking at him. Or remember when we met in town? That cold stare was completely different from the look of a lover. I didn't even think he had feelings for you at all. It was all kind of fake." Kate laughed and slyly, looking at her friend, replied, "Did you happen to be in love with my fiancé yourself? Maybe that's why I made up that story. But you know, we're going to get married anyway. And you, as the bride's best friend, will you be the maid of honor? Oh, come on. Jake loves me very much. I can't play that." With a wink at Amber, she added, "Don't be sad. You're bound to meet your prince, too. Now, coffee and let's go. I'll drive you home, and we're meeting Jake in an hour. Let's go ring shopping." Kate didn't seem to pay much attention to Amber's words, but a worm of doubt lingered in her soul at the wedding rush. She quickly forgot about that conversation as she continued to prepare for the most important event of her life. On the last night before the wedding, Gregory called and urged her to come over. Kate sighed. She didn't want to think about anything at all that evening, except tomorrow's event. But knowing Gregory, she knew he wouldn't let up so easily. 20 minutes later, the man was in the kitchen, spreading the photos on the table and telling her, "I didn't listen to you after all, and decided to check on Jake. He knew he'd been penniless since birth. His parents drank themselves to death in the country when he turned 17. So he decided to go to the city for the rich life. But he wasn't going to work. He just found rich beauties like you and lived off them. He was even married to 2 of them. So officially, you'll be his third wife. He began pointing to the pictures one by one and explaining. This one is of his first wife, the daughter of a furniture magnate. By the way, the next picture is of their wedding with your chosen one, looking happy. In this photo, he's kissing the daughter of a businessman who owns real estate agencies in every city. So in the next picture, happy father is walking in his daughter and your Jake's wedding reception. Glancing at the silent Kate, he said pleadingly, "Jane, please help your father not to make a terrible mistake. You are still so young, and you will meet your destiny, but not this rogue who only wants your fortune." Kate, continuing to remain silent, looked up at him and, surprisingly, answered quite calmly, "Okay, Ethan, thank you. I'll think about it. I'll definitely think about it. Now, if you're all done, I'd like to rest. I have a wedding tomorrow, after all, and you should definitely come." He rose and, waving his hand sadly, headed for the exit. Kate sat there for a long time, looking at the pictures left on the table. Then she decided that everyone at that age had a past, and she wasn't going to dredge it up, since Jake hadn't seen fit to tell her. Jessica went to bed and tried not to think about it anymore. In the morning, as if nothing had happened, Kate was preparing for the wedding. The guest masters were doing her hair and makeup, and Polly, sitting on the sidelines, wiped away her tears and said, "What a beauty, and I've never seen anyone more beautiful in my life. I only wish Gregory and Susan had lived to see this day." Jessica exclaimed loudly and added, "That's all right, pretty girl. They are looking down on you from heaven, admiring you and rejoicing. The main thing is for you, girl, to be happy." Kate at this moment was immersed in her thoughts and almost did not notice what was happening around her. Her mind, as much as she wanted it to be, went back to her conversation with Ethan last night. She couldn't understand why Jake hadn't told her himself. She didn't want to believe that her lover was only around for the money. His attitude toward her, his love for her, seemed the most genuine and sincere. "Here, you can take a look. I hope you like it. We can go to the registry office," came the voice of the makeup artist, bringing her back to reality. Kate looked in the mirror and, smiling sadly, went to the exit. She decided to go to the registry office alone. Sending Polly and Amber in the company car, she walked to the sub decorated by the wedding agency and stopped for a moment. She remembered her father's words about choosing a groom carefully and not rushing into marriage. But the driver who opened the cabin door in front of her seemed to have made up his mind for her. On the way from the cottage village to the city, she stared thoughtfully out the window and was immersed in her thoughts. Kate was distraught. Didn't know what she should do next. As the car stood at one of the traffic lights, Jessica suddenly saw a beggar begging at the entrance to one of the supermarkets. "Stop here and wait for me," I quickly instructed the driver and jumped out into the street at the same moment. The chauffeur shrugged his shoulders in bewilderment and, after waiting for a green traffic signal, drove a little way and parked. Passers-by looked in surprise at the bride in a beautiful, obviously expensive wedding dress, who said something quickly to the beggar. True, the beggar listened with wide-open eyes in which fright, fear, and confusion were mixed. Kate quickly opened her beaded purse and took out a bill and put it in the homeless man's hand. While he looked at the bill in surprise, not believing his happiness, the bride looked around. Then she grabbed his hand and literally dragged him somewhere by force. In about 10 minutes from the fitting room of one of the nearest inexpensive clothing stores came out a vagrant dressed in clothes bought by Kate. And from another stall appeared the bride herself, but already in the clothes she had bought. The vendors standing at the entrance apparently saw Kate shuffling with broken shoes on the asphalt and holding her expensive wedding outfit in her hands. It looked as if they had never seen such a spectacle before. The driver, noticing some beggar woman grasping the door handle, jumped out and immediately stopped confusedly, asking you, "What's wrong?" Kate, throwing her dress into the back seat, immediately climbed in herself and, with a wink, replied, "It's okay. That's the way it has to be. Let's go to the registry office. But don't drive right up to the entrance. Stop a couple of houses away. If I don't show up within an hour, you can leave and bring the dress to the address where they picked me up today." In the back of her mind, she still hoped that when Jake saw her dressed as a beggar, he'd say he loved her and they'd sign anyway. But the uneasiness remained. The driver stopped, as she'd asked, around the corner of the wedding palace. Kate got out and continued on foot. When she appeared in her new guise in the luxurious hall with columns and stucco, all the guests turned around in an instant and began to stare at her in surprise. At the wedding gathered almost half the city. And, as they say, it was all the cream of society. Only the famous and rich people of their town were here on this day. Men in suits and tailcoats, ladies in evening gowns and expensive jewelry. The groom, standing surrounded by his friends, did not recognize Kate at the first moments and shouted indignantly, "Who let that tramp in here?" "For what the hell, some kind of security." "Call security." Kate, heading toward him through the retreating guests, smiling, began to say, "Honey, no need for security. It's me. Don't you recognize me? I apologize for looking like this, but something terrible has happened in the last few days that we haven't seen each other. I got involved in some kind of bad scam, and I seem to have lost everything. You know, everything. I don't even have my parents' house anymore. I was too scared to tell you. I'm sorry, but then I thought, you don't love me for my money. That means we'll still get married and be happy, even if we don't have riches." "You agree with me," Kate said. She watched her fiancé's reaction carefully. He stood pale as a sheet. As soon as she had finished Steenish speaking, Jake suddenly pulled his hand, which Kate had been holding in hers all this time, squeamishly, and spoke through gritted teeth. "You're crazy. How can I marry you now? I certainly don't want a wife who's going to sit somewhere and beg for alms. That's not for me." Kate said in a perfectly calm voice, "Well, no, it isn't. I thought money wasn't the most important thing for love. By the way, the banquet isn't paid for either. So if you're thinking of going out, think about who's going to pay for it." Turning around, she headed for the exit under the surprised looks of the guests. She thought about the fact that not so long ago she could not even imagine that her clothes and appearance could change her fiancé's attitude to her so much, no matter how she held herself. A very unpleasant residue remained on her soul. It was unbearably hard for her. At that moment, she once again remembered her father's admonition about marriage, and Ethan's pleas not to take that crazy step. Turns out they'd both been right. And Jake wasn't the kind of man to be with her for better or for worse. Leaving the registry office, Kate was pleasantly surprised. The SUV, decorated with flowers, was just around the corner. At getting into the back seat, she asked for a ride home. At this point, she really wanted to just be alone. As she got into the car, something jingled in the pocket of her old dress. Kate reached in with her hand and pulled out a small cellophane bag. There was some money in it, most of which was change, and some other old picture. She carefully pulled it out of the bag. As soon as she looked at it, her heart raced. Holding the photograph with a trembling hand, she looked at it again and again. It was hard for her to believe, but in the picture, smiling happily, stood her father. He was gently hugging the slender brown-haired girl and seemed insanely happy. By the way, Kate almost shouted to the driver, "Please, let's get to that place downtown where the store I changed my clothes was." The chauffeur braked sharply in bewilderment, looked at Kate, but there was so much pleading in her eyes that he sighed and silently turned in the opposite direction. She decided to urgently find the beggar to find out where she got the photo from, but the time was wasted. Neither at the store nor across the street in the crosswalk was he there. Without an answer to her question, Kate had to return home. All night she lay awake, thinking first of the beggar and then of her father. Jessica couldn't believe he could betray her mom like that and have an affair on the side. At that moment, even the disrupted wedding took a back seat. Kate could hardly wait until morning and, without breakfast, got into the car, driving again to the place where she had met the beggar. But he was not there this day either. She was ready to fall into despair. Seeing a bakery stall standing nearby, she approached the vendor. "Hello, can you tell me? There was a girl begging for alms here yesterday." Kate began without any hope of help. She was also wearing this gray dress and a knit sweater. "Do you know if she comes here often? Or can you tell me where I can find her?" The man continued to fold the napkins in some special way. Without taking a break from his work, he replied, "Lenka, she just left. They said she was chased away from the station, and the poor thing has to live somehow, so she's asking for alms from shoppers. And at this time she's only at the orphanage. Maybe she has a little boy there, so she runs to him in the mornings." Kate rejoiced, and thanking her, hurried to the car. Where was the orphanage located? She knew, for it was the only one in the town and was situated on the very outskirts. So there was not much traffic on the road to their cottage village at this time, and she reached the place very quickly. And even from afar, Kate saw the person she was looking for. Still wearing the same clothes she had bought her the day before, the tramp was sitting on a bench, and watching the children playing behind the fence at the orphanage. But Kate decided not to rush into questions about her father. Taking a seat next to her, she asked quietly, "Do you have a child there?" The stranger turned around and, apparently recognizing the girl immediately, nodded silently. "Then why is he there? And you are here?" Kate decided to ask again. After a moment's silence, the vagrant turned to her, looking at her appraisingly, as if deciding whether or not she should answer. But then her sad eyes filled with tears, and she stared at the babies again and began to say, "It happened. It wasn't my fault. After school, I couldn't get a job. But one day I got lucky. By chance, I found an ad in the newspaper. A rich house required a maid. Surprisingly, I was hired almost immediately. The house was huge. 3 floors, many rooms, some of which were guest rooms. One floor was completely dedicated to the master suite, and showers, closet of course. The owners ran a well-known business in the city, and I can't remember the name of their firm now, but it was something to do with wood. For the few months I worked there before their son came along, there were no complaints about me. But as soon as John came back from overseas, where he was training, I knew from the first minute I was lost. Jessica sighed heavily, as if she was back in that time, and a smile appeared on her face. But immediately her face became sad and pensive again. In my mind, I knew I wasn't a match for John, she said. Who he was and who I was, but I couldn't help it. He was so tender and affectionate. I couldn't resist. We started seeing each other in secret from his parents. I mean, we weren't really seeing each other. It's just that John started urging me to be intimate on a regular basis, and I, naive fool, hoped that he loved me as much as I loved him. She suddenly stopped talking and looked at Kate and asked sadly, "Would you be interested in that? Why should it be any more? After all, nothing could be changed." But Kate, you see, wanted to talk. So she took her hand and said, "Even if I don't need it so much, you definitely need it. It'll make you feel better. So maybe there's something I can do to help. Tell me what happened next. That bastard left you and the baby." Jessica sighed and, grinning, continued. "As soon as John found out I was pregnant, he immediately said he wasn't ready for a serious relationship, much less with me. He said I was out of his league, and my parents would do anything to prevent an unequal marriage. When John's father and mother found out, they were furious. Threatened, demanded to terminate the pregnancy, especially the mother yelled that she would not tolerate such a disgrace in their family, and that the only son will never marry a maid. The rich family was afraid that after a while I would blackmail them, or what's more, file for child support. No matter how I tried to explain that I would have no claims, it was as if they didn't hear me. After all, I decided for myself right away that no matter what it cost me, I would keep the baby. At this point, it suddenly began to rain heavily, and Kate suggested, "Let's go back to my car and we can continue." Jessica surprisingly did not resist, silently got up and followed her. Carefully climbing into the front seat, she looked out the window, and seeing the silent question in Kate's eyes, continued, "So I quit them at once, of course, and while my belly wasn't very noticeable, I managed to get a job in a stall as a salesman. My mother had given me a small place to live, thank God, but it was my own. It was difficult, of course. But on the other hand, I was glad that no one would be able to take my baby's life at the moment when everything seemed to be behind me. One evening, the police rang my doorbell. Imagine, these rich people did not settle down saving my son from shame, decided to make me a thief and put me in jail. What could I do? I didn't have money for even the cheapest lawyer, and they bought everything in town. Anyway, not even a month later, I found myself behind bars, allegedly for stealing the expensive jewelry of my rich mother. It was such a blow to me that it seemed to completely divide my life into before and after. There was even the threat of miscarriage, what I did not see and suffered behind bars, but it wasn't enough for those scoundrels." Turning to Kate, with eyes full of tears, she asked quietly in a trembling voice, "Tell me, why are people so cruel? I've done nothing wrong to them. I just wanted to give birth and raise my baby myself. Not only did they send me to prison, but they managed to harm me there too. I don't know how much they paid to whom and why, but my son was taken to a baby home almost immediately after his birth, and from there they transferred him here to an orphanage. I almost went crazy when I found out, but I decided as soon as I got out of prison, I'd take my Michael right away. What good did it do me to find him? I haven't been able to find a job since I got out. Nobody wants to hire me, so I have to beg for alms to survive. communicating with my son in the mornings through the fence when they go for a walk while the principal is away. Jessica absolutely forbids the nannies to let me in. I don't know how to go on with my life or what to do, but Mike should definitely not grow up in an orphanage. Kate suddenly held out the picture to her and asked, "Emily, tell me, where did you get this?" She took the picture in her hands and looked into the face of the woman in the photo and said sadly, "This is all I have left of my mom. I don't know the man in the photo, but my mom used to look at him a lot and cry. And I'm guessing it's probably my father, but I've never been able to find out for sure." Kate's heart clenched. She tried to find familiar facial features in her companion. Her only thought was that if Emily's mother was having an affair with her father, that meant they were sisters. It even began to occur to her that there was a lot about Emily that was one and the same as her dad's. After a few minutes, she was almost certain that Emily was her sister. But until the DNA test, which she decided to do in secret, she wanted to avoid jumping to conclusions and say nothing. For starters, Kate had made up her mind to help the unfortunate one. Despite the fact that the difference between her and Emily was only a couple of years, the latter had already had time to suffer as much as people sometimes experience in a lifetime. Taking her hand, Kate said quietly, "I'll help you. I'll definitely help you. For starters, let's not have you begging for alms anymore." She reached into her purse and, without counting, pulled all the cash out of her wallet. Emily tried to timidly refuse, but Kate literally forced her to take the money. "I think you've had enough of this for now. We'll figure something out from here," Kate said in a tone that brooked no objection. Emily's eyes glistened with tears. She burst into tears and began to say, "I don't want on anything. Just help Michael, please. Get him out of the orphanage." Kate reached into her purse again and pulled out a handkerchief and held it out to Emily. Sure, don't worry, please," Kate said, stroking her hand. "We'll be sure to pick it up. Just need some time." They talked some more. And when Emily had calmed down, Kate offered her a ride home. The so-called apartment, inherited from her mother, was on the very outskirts in a dilapidated barracks. "Sorry, not invited to visit," Emily said, embarrassed. "I don't think this lodging is worth seeing." But Kate realized, without going inside, that the conditions in which Emily lived were far from acceptable. She, almost certain that that one was her sister, was ready to take Emily in at once, but there was something stopping her. She put the handkerchief she'd given Emily in a bag and immediately found out where the accelerated genetic examination was being conducted and went there. That same day in the evening, she already knew what documents were needed to take Michael away, and the result of the examination would speed up the process. While waiting, Kate thought about her sister every day. She was already almost certain that they were related by their father, but the result she received a couple days later came as a shock. It said in black and white that she and Jessica were total strangers, with no relation whatsoever. When Kate left the clinic, she got into the car and couldn't move for a long time. She reread the documents again and caught herself at that moment thinking that she was sorry that Jessica was not her sister. All day she thought about it, and finally she realized that no matter what, she wanted to help in some way. Kate has decided to file for custody of Michael. There was no official way for Jessica to take the boy yet. First thing the next morning, she went to the orphanage, and having met the director, expressed her desire to take the child. At the same time, she did not say whom she wanted to adopt. The director, a full-figured woman who did not seem very pleasant, listened to Kate's made-up story about the child lost in childbirth and explained in detail how the guardianship procedure was carried out. Then they went to the playroom, where the nanny brought some of the kids. Kate recognized Michael right away. Jessica had shown his picture, but she wouldn't have been mistaken either way. He looked a lot like his mom, and Kate took a step toward him and quietly asked, "What's your name, baby?" He looked at her at first with a kind of unchildishly serious look. Then he came over and just as quietly said, "Mike, and you look a lot like my mom." If it hadn't been for the DNA test, she would have agreed with the little guy. Indeed, in some ways they were similar to Jessica, and Kate didn't even realize what. As she approached the baby, she smiled and, taking him in her arms, said, "That's good. Then we'll be friends." As she left the orphanage that day, she asked Emma, the director, to allow her to take Michael out for at least a few hours on the weekends while the registration was in progress. After some thought, she said yes. Kate immediately went to Jessica to tell her. From that day on, while the registration was in progress, she began to take Michael every chance she got. And when she bought a phone, she would call and Helen would tell him where they would be walking, so that Jessica could look at her son. In consultation, they both decided that Jessica didn't need to see him yet. The boy might talk to the orphanage, and there could be trouble with custody. Everything went as planned. Kate worked from morning till night. The business left after her parents, although it was profitable, but still required a lot of effort and attention. At the same time, she found time to pick up Michael at least a few times a week. She and Jessica couldn't wait until Kate could take the baby, so that his mother could finally communicate with him openly. Kate was even beginning to catch herself enjoying spending time with the boy. He'd become like family to her. After another such meeting, she returned home in high spirits. That day, she was told that she would be able to pick up Michael in 2 days. And she didn't know what would happen next, but she was sure she could handle it. She would try to help Amber. After taking a shower, Kate decided to watch the news on social media before going to bed. Taking a sip of her childhood favorite, lemon mint tea, Kate choked and, pushing the cup away, began to quickly read what she saw. There was information on one of the social networks that Jessica couldn't believe. But in front of her were photos and videos of her visits to the orphanage and meetings with Amber. Set against the backdrop of an old, shabby barracks, the pictures captured almost all of her trips to Mike's house. In one photo, they were walking out of the orphanage holding hands. In another, they were laughing in the park with ice cream in their hands. Then there was a picture of them on a merry-go-round, and again holding hands when they returned to the orphanage. So under all these photos was an article written under a pseudonym. In it, some scoundrel described how she, a well-known city heiress of a multi-million-dollar business, leads a stormy personal life. To the author wrote that the consequence of one of the fleeting romances was the appearance of a baby. To the whole world, he claimed that Kate allegedly gave birth to a child in secret and immediately refused the baby. Kate tore herself away from the text and greedily breathed in the air. She was simply gasping with indignation. Who needed to follow her and put this nonsense on display for all to see? Taking a sedative, she returned to the laptop, deciding to finish reading the article. Then the impudent man stated that, after a while, the negligent mother began to suffer remorse, and now under the guise of a distant relative visits the child. At the end of the article, the scoundrel asked subscribers to make the necessary conclusion. He said that the mother who abandoned the child cannot be a reliable partner in business. Having finished reading, Kate leaned back in her chair and thought. Some words and phrases in the text seemed familiar to her. She began to recall who might have needed to slander her in such a way. She remembered all the people she knew and didn't know, but it was impossible to think of any of them. She basically, like her late parents, had no enemies at all. But after a couple hours, she had little doubt anymore. And she was even sure she wasn't mistaken and knew who had done it. Glancing at her watch, she didn't hesitate to pick up the phone and dialed the number from memory. As soon as the other end answered, Kate asked unkindly, "Why do you want to do this? The article on the internet was your doing. And you've been following me around." All those snapshots, photos, you realize that any lie will be exposed sooner or later. And why waste your time? Explain what and to whom you want to prove. A chuckle was heard on the other end, which was immediately replaced by an angry voice. "Like you don't understand, don't play the innocent sheep. It's all your own fault. Did you think I could so easily forgive the shame you caused me at the registry office? It's not something you forget. You think that by denying me my rights to your fortune by not registering your marriage, you'll continue to live happily ever after. No, I don't think so. I'm going to leave you so far behind that you'll soon be like your beggar girlfriend with your hand out." Kate hung up the phone, trying not to pay attention to the words of her failed fiancé. But soon the business was really in trouble. New contracts were almost never signed. Clients hinted that trust in such a business is very important. And when they asked how the child was doing, they let her know that they were aware of the whole crazy story. But for a moment she regretted even getting involved in all this. Once she knew that Amber wasn't her sister, she could have refused to talk to them. But she wanted to do a good deed by returning the boy to his mother. But it was too late to back down. In the meantime, she had already taken Michael from the orphans, and having hardly persuaded Jessica to live with her, moved her to her place. Kate realized that at any moment she could be checked by the guardianship authorities to see in what conditions the baby lives. So she asked Jessica to move in with her. Yes, she refused, to explain that she didn't want to be a burden. So Kate offered her the vacant housekeeper's position. Polly had just left for home, and said she wouldn't be back for another year. She was due to have a granddaughter, so she decided to help her daughter. The first night after moving into Kate's house, Jessica, after putting Michael to bed, burst into tears and said, "You have no idea what you've done for me and my son. I will thank God all my life for meeting you, and I'm ready to do anything you need me to do. I can do laundry, cleaning, cooking, just to be near my son every moment." Kate began to reassure Jessica and offered to take the room right next door to Michael's. And the next morning, stepping into the kitchen, she was pleasantly surprised. Jessica, neatly dressed in the homemade suit Kate had given her, was cooking something at the stove. Breakfast was already on the table. When she heard the footsteps, she turned around and, smiling, said, "Good morning. I'm sorry I'm running the place. You said yourself I could. I made everything for breakfast. I just didn't make the coffee so it wouldn't get cold. And while you're washing up, I'll have time for everything." "Good morning." Smiling back, Kate replied, "Thank you very much. Good for you running the household. Mike's still asleep. By the way, let's go you already. The age difference between us isn't at all the same for howling." A few days later, Kate didn't regret leaving Jessica behind. She was doing a great job at home and spending all her free time with her son. Kate noticed that with their arrival, the house seemed to come alive. When she came home from work, she knew she was expected and tried to get out as quickly as possible. One such evening, she stopped at the store for groceries and headed home. But at the turn into a cottage community, she didn't realize what had happened. The car was literally thrown off the road. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The car, several times overturned, hit a tree standing aside. Kate lost consciousness. When she woke up, she was already lying on a stretcher. There were people standing around. She saw Ethan nearby. Barely audible, she whispered, "Ethan, there's a woman with a baby in my house. Little things happen to me. Take care of them and run things. Tell her everything's going to be all right. She won't let you down, I know." The way the man nodded, she knew he'd heard everything, and she was sure he would. Kate closed her eyes and was carried into the ambulance. Ethan went to her house immediately after Kate left, telling Jessica what had happened, including Kate's request for a transfer. Jessica cried, clutching an uncomprehending Michael to her chest, and said confusedly, "How come? What is this? I don't understand anything about these matters." "What now, Kate?" Ethan tried to calm down, saying that he would help in any way he could. At Jessica's request, he spent almost an hour talking about what Kate was doing. And then, glancing at his watch, apologizing, he said, "I'm leaving you my number. As soon as you need any help, call me." After putting Michael to bed, Jessica herself couldn't sleep for a long time. She was terrified. After all, running the business Kate had entrusted to her was not an easy task. But Jessica could not refuse, because she promised to help her savior in everything. The next day, Ethan arrived with bags full of groceries, and from the doorstep said, "In the hospital, the mistress is still unchanged. She's the intensive care unit, in a coma. The doctors give no prognosis, so, Jessica, you'll have to dive into things. You'll have a nurse come in tomorrow morning. Her co-workers recommended her to me. They'll send a driver to pick you up and meet you at the office. We'll get you up to speed." In the morning, leaving Michael with a nanny, a woman in her 40s, Jessica set off into a new, as yet unknown life. She had once been the best student in school. Everything new came easily to her, and remembering things was easy. Now these skills came in handy, and she plunged headlong into the study of the case she had been entrusted with. Just a few days after the accident, all the yellow press of the city was full of pictures of her. Reports that the rich woman, who had fallen into a coma, had entrusted the management of the business to a complete stranger. Some called Jessica a con artist, some called her an imposter. And only Ethan Condon said, "Do not even worry. These journalists love to sling mud at people. What do you want? It's their bread. The main thing, you and I know that this is not true. Now, since Kate's will was like this, it's the right thing to do. She's very clever, and she wouldn't give such an order for nothing." Jessica was grateful for his support at such moments, and she didn't know how she was going to cope with all this. Each day was harder than the last. It was only when she returned to her son that she could be herself. Jessica loved such evenings when, having let the nanny go, she could spend hours with Michael building a construction set or drawing. On one of those evenings, A visitor suddenly appeared on her doorstep. At first she was frightened, taking him for a thief. But the young man was too well and expensively dressed, and he held the keys to the house in his hand with the same key ring as Kate's. "There you are," said the stranger in surprise. "I wanted to surprise Kate, and here we have guests. Where's the hostess herself?" Jessica, continuing to look at him, replied that she was in the hospital, which, he thought, did not seem to embarrass the guest at all. He took off his shoes and strode masterfully into the kitchen, placing the cake he had brought on the table. "Jessica," she thought he said somewhat playfully, "what a mess. But I hope she gets better soon. Now that I'm here, we'll get acquainted and have tea. My name's Jake, by the way, and I'm a very old friend of Kate's. You don't know how good friends with her we are, do you? She practically thinks of me as her brother. I'm always willing to help her with anything. It's true that we've been estranged for a while, but that didn't change my attitude towards her." Lena looked at him, and Jake acted as if she had come to visit him. He put the kettle on and started pulling out the dishes, and she realized that he really did know everything in this house well. Over tea, Jake made Elena feel completely at ease with him. He got along with her very quickly, and she in turn talked about the help Kate had given him and a request to take over the running of the business. She lamented that even if she wanted to, it was very difficult for her to do so. And Jake reassured her that he would do his best to help. From that day on, he visited them almost every day. It turned out that Jake was very well versed in the affairs of the firm and became a real salvation for Lena. He asked her not to say anything about him to anyone, adding that evil tongues would start talking nonsense. She even conducted a couple of transactions on her behalf, transferring several large payments to the company's accounts, and he convinced Lena that it was a very necessary and important decision, and she believed him. But it bothered her that Jake had taken little interest in his friend's health. Not even once had he visited Kate in the hospital. Unlike Lena, who stopped by almost every day, but each time she learned that there was no improvement. But she didn't know what to do next, how to help her savior. She begged the doctors to do everything possible and impossible, offering any money. She was ready at any moment to sign documents on the transfer of funds for treatment. But the doctor only sighed sadly and said, "Not everything, my dear, is measured by money. In this particular case, only time or a miracle can help. Let's wait and hope." Lena came home in tears each time and prayed that her rich friend would be helped. Jake always tried to comfort her in such cases and surround her with care. She didn't know what she could do without him. He used to make everything seem easy. He was like a fish out of water in business. With Mike, he had become a good friend, and he had won Lena over with his attention and tenderness. No one had ever treated her like that. She was afraid to admit it to herself, but she realized she had fallen in love with Jake and was happy. When he said one night, "Lenochka, honey, I can't take it anymore. You and Mike have become very dear and close to me. I didn't even expect that in such a short time I could become so attached to you. I don't want to be parted from you for one more minute. Please, marry me." On the one hand, Jessica could only dream of such a thing. But on the other, she was embarrassed that this was Kate's friend, and she feared he was not telling her something about their relationship. But Jake had been too persistent. He managed to convince Kate that he and Kate were just friends, adding that she'd be happy to know he'd met his love. They signed quietly, no wedding or fuss. They just went to the registry office and registered the marriage. And then Jake suggested dinner at a restaurant. But the nanny called and said Mike had a fever, which changed their plans. For the first time, Jessica saw Jake get angry. What, she can't handle him on her own? What's a fever? She ruined the whole evening. Jessica remained silent, but was amazed. How could she say that and go out knowing the baby was sick? All evening, Jake was not happy, but then somehow changed abruptly and hugged her and said, "Well, I'm sorry. It's just that even though it wasn't a wedding, I wanted to celebrate with you two somehow. It was a shame to give up everything, but what can I do? Let's do it this way. You and then the next couple of days stay with your son. Only in the office warn that I am now, your lawful husband, have the same rights to drive. I'll drive down there tomorrow. Get everything in order quickly. You won't mind, will you?" Jake had indeed turned the management of the company's affairs completely over to himself after the wedding, and Jessica spent most of her time taking care of the house and her son. Almost immediately after the marriage was registered, Jake moved into Kate's house. He explained it by the fact that in his apartment in the city, Mike is worse than in the air, in nature. But all this time, Jessica did not forget about her friend for a day. Kate had been in a coma for almost 3 years. The doctors hinted that hope, even the last hope, was already gone. But Jessica didn't want to believe it. And time after time, going to the clinic, hoped to learn about the improvement. However, everything remained unchanged. When she returned home, she couldn't hold back her tears and, sobbing, prayed to God to help Kate. Jake was getting annoyed at times like this. "Jess, how many times can you do this? She's been down for so long, and even if she does recover, she'll be a vegetable. Sign the papers and have them take her off life support. At least she's got some life. Well, you keep hoping it'll be over soon for her and for us." Jessica didn't understand her husband, for he and Kate were, in his own words, friends. But she put his nervousness down to his fatigue and went to the hospital again and again. At some point, she noticed that every time she arrived, the same orderly was on duty around Kate. And this had been the case both a year ago and 2 years ago. And now he was looking at the patient in a special way. Jessica decided to meet him. It turned out that Alex studied at medical school and worked part-time at the hospital. He said with some trepidation, when I first saw her, it was like I felt like she needed me. And that, don't look at the state she's in. Her brain is alive. She can hear everything, feel everything. I talk to her every day. I tell her about my life, my studies. Sometimes I think she already knows more about me than I do." Alex smiled sadly, but then he added confidently, "I know for a fact Kate has to get better. Just please don't sign any papers. Give her a chance." When Amber walked out of the hospital, Jessica didn't cry for the first time and was almost certain that her friend would wake up. When she got home, she tried to tell her husband about Alex, but he only brushed it off. "You've got no one to listen to." Some orderly thought he was a doctor and started making predictions. For the first time, Amber couldn't take it anymore and snapped. She spoke indignantly about how he, as a friend, could have gone to the hospital for once. To which he surprisingly agreed to go just the next day. What was their surprise when the attending physician joyfully came out of the office to meet her with the words, "Amber, I saw you through the window and decided to be the first to bring you the good news. Your old ward is doing better. Let's go quickly. You'll see for yourself." It seemed to Amber that Jake was not happy about the news. He tried to take a step backward, but he regained his senses and followed her. As soon as they entered the room, Kate opened her eyes, and Amber wore so much horror in them that she was confused. Kate tried to say something, but the doctor immediately warned, everyone out. She can't worry." The last thing Amber heard clearly was a whisper, "Traitor." Accepting that about their relationship with Jake, she was completely at odds with it and hoped that once her friend was better, she'd improve everything. But doubt resurfaced in her soul. After all, if, as Jake had said, they were only friends, then Kate should have been glad. So back at home, Amber took a long time to decide to talk. And when she gathered her courage, she asked, "Jake, tell me, was there more than friendship between you and Kate? When she saw you today, she called me a bad word." What happened next was something she had in no way expected. Her husband became furious, began to shout that he had never loved her, and that he'd found her deliberately to hurt Kate. And he also said that in his relationship with Kate, or with her, he always had one goal, to get the business, and he succeeded. It turns out that, fully trusting her husband, she once signed, without looking, the documents that fully transferred the right to manage everything that she had. Then everything went like a dream. Her recently beloved husband gave her an hour to pack, and said that after that he would not want to see her, or her, as he said, a freak. Now in his house, that evening she found herself once again on the street with one suitcase and a child, glad only that her mother's room in the barracks was still hers. Calling a cab, she went there, hoping to change something in the morning. First, she decided to go to the hospital and talk to Kate. Hardly waiting for dawn, Jessica got ready and, taking Mike with her, went to the clinic. Alex, as before, sat by her bedside, spoon-feeding her, urging her to eat at least a little. Noticing Jessica, Kate turned away and stared out the window into the distance. "Kate, hi, I'm so glad you've finally come to your senses," Jessica began timidly. "I've been praying, believing all these years. I understand you're upset with me. And if it's because of Jake, I believed him, that you were true friends, nothing more. He swore you'd even be glad to know he was married. How could I have known he was a scoundrel and a con man? I don't know myself. I signed over everything you entrusted me with to him. And now I have nothing left but my mom's room in the barracks. I'm so sorry. How could I have thought it would be like this? Jessica stood at the door of the ward and wept quietly. And Kate, after being silent for a while, turned and said, "Look here, please. That rascal has been trying to get me into marriage to get hold of everything. There you have fallen for that trick. Let's forget it like a bad dream. I was just thinking we're both good, trusting that rascal." Jessica sat down on the edge of the bed and hugged Kate and burst into tears even more. The latter began to stroke her head, but still just as quietly. "Can we think of something?" "Well, not everyone lives with $1 million. At that moment, Alex's voice came out of the blue. "I think I might be able to help you. Kate, from the first day I saw you, I knew I couldn't live without you. I don't have $1 million, but I love you very much. And in the presence of my friend, I ask you to be my wife." He walked over and, taking Kate's hand, kissed hand. At that moment, Jessica noticed the sparkle in her friend's eyes. After a moment of silence, she replied faintly, "I agree. Thank you for being there all this time and believing in me." Sure, already when a joyful Alex left on the nurse's call, she said, "You know, the whole time I was in a coma, I heard him, everything he said, every word, and it was like his voice was calling me, beckoning me here into this world. Every day I felt his caring hands, his tender gaze." Smiling, Jessica said, "I thought he lived by your bedside all this time, occasionally leaving to study and sleep." At that moment, Jessica turned pale and slowly began to settle down on the bed. Everything happened completely unexpectedly, and Kate fearfully began to reach for the nurse call button. But Alex returned to the room very timely and immediately ran for help. All the staff put Jessica on a stretcher and carried her to the ward. Alex reassured Kate, saying that the hospital's good doctors, and Mike was taken in by a nurse who lives literally a couple houses away from the hospital. Jessica's Zoe had raised 5 grandchildren, he said, smiling, so she could certainly handle one. Toward evening, Amber knocked on the door in her hospital gown. She seemed especially pale, crouching timidly on the edge of the bed. In a trembling voice, she announced, "I'm pregnant, with twins besides. I don't know what to do." Barely holding back tears, Jessica said, "What is there to think about? We have to keep both of them. I won't be able to do it, but it's okay, we'll grow up. We won't be lost. We'll stay with Alex for now." Eddie offered. His parents left him a small, but 3-room apartment somewhere in the suburbs, and then we'll figure it out. A few weeks later, Kate was discharged, and they began to live together. Mike was put in daycare. Amber went to work as a saleswoman in a store near the house, and Kate slowly began to implement a new business idea. Alex, after their marriage registration, became a real caring husband and devoted all his free time from school and work to his family. He treated Kate with great tenderness and was ready to do anything to make her happy. Time flew imperceptibly. Shortly before Amber's delivery, the doctors informed her that she would have a C-section, saying that with such a rare blood type as hers, it would be difficult to find a donor in case of emergency. They advised her to take care of it in advance. When she told Kate all this, she was shocked. She had the same blood and immediately decided to take another DNA test. The result lived up to her hopes, and indeed she and Amber were sisters, the real deal, and the man in the photo was their mutual father. Crying and hugging, they couldn't believe their happiness. And Kate, as the eldest, even if only for a year, calmed her sister. "Now we will definitely not be lost. Wait, we'll be together again." It was indeed as if they had become closer after learning that they were sisters. Slowly, everyone in the apartment began to prepare for the arrival of 2 more tenants, and as soon as the babies came into the world, all the attention and worries were shifted to them. One day, Alex came back from work especially excited. Literally in one breath, he told that a patient was admitted to them after a traffic accident and strong alcohol intoxication. His face seemed familiar to me from the first minutes, he began to tell. When the patient started talking in a drunken stupor about how he was being punished by God for his past, in which he had ruined the brakes on his bride, I remembered, Kate, your story and his when he came in with Amber. Seeing the sisters listening to him with their mouths open, he smiled slyly and said, "Well, if someone will feed me, then I'll continue." During dinner, Alex announced that he'd gotten the idea to turn on the tape recorder and, praising his cleverness, had recorded all the details of the non-fiance's crime. "Can you believe it?" Alex said, turning to his wife. "This scoundrel bragged in detail how he personally ruined your car, and to make it even more convincing, he showed a picture of you on his cell phone. Without even realizing I was taking notes, he confirmed that he'd swindled you out of your business. In general, I have an army friend in the police, and I've already called him. Tomorrow I'll bring him the material. You just need to write a statement." They were able to prove everything very quickly. And 2 months later, Amber and Kate were happily moving things back. And Alex, having invited the same fellow Andrew to help, smilingly said, "Hey, if it wasn't for you, I would have been carrying these princesses' outfits out of the car by myself for another month. Thank you, buddy. By the way, will you stay for dinner tonight? We'll have a little drink to the victory over the swindler and the move. We'll make kebabs." Kate, noticing Andrew's eyes on Amber, immediately supported her spouse and said, Yes, Andrew, stay. We'd be very happy to. Especially since my husband doesn't know everything yet. We're going to need a godfather soon. You seem like you'd be perfect for that role." Well, Amber and Alex looked at each other in surprise. It had already been decided that Alex would be the twins' godfather. Realizing their looks, Kate laughed and, hugging her husband, said, "Not the twins. A baby boy. Darling, we're going to have a new addition." That evening, Kate, sitting at the large dinner table with those closest to her, really wanted, as Polly had said, for her parents to look down on her from heaven and rejoice. The midday heat and the breeze blowing in from the quarried sand pit created a dusty, stuffy veil over the winding ribbon of country road that made his throat sore and his eyes water. So much so that it didn't even help to turn away from the curb where the uncultivated grasses had grown to man-sized proportions. Sneezing, Logan once again berated himself for having been tempted to walk. He would have chosen the bus and would have been in the district center by now, but as it was, he had to walk for at least another hour. Just fine. The guy stopped for a moment, dropped his backpack on the ground and pulled out a bottle of water, greedily gulped it down. He poured the rest of it over his head. That's a little better. Then, throwing the strap of the backpack on the other shoulder, went further. And then, when the road made another detour rounding a birch grove, exclaimed and smiled. Well, how could I have forgotten about it? He had already forgotten about it 100 times in these places, but he had his topographical absent-mindedness here. He could turn off the road and go along the lake. Such a rearrangement of the route added a few kilometers, but every step, of course, should now be easier. Logan was so happy that he even began to hum a cheerful tune of some song under his nose. "Uncle." A child's voice called out to him, and Logan froze. Was he imagining things? He looked around. Didn't he seem to be the only one here? "Uncle, can I ask you a favor?" The voice came again, now even closer, and Logan, before he could remember, half-jokingly and colorfully about all sorts of wild mystical spirits lured by imitation of human speech, saw the owner of this voice. It was a girl of about 7 years old, thin and white all over from the pale skin and a scattering of freckles from the nose and up to the knees to the golden, sun-whitened hair. A little girl in a dress that, judging by its drab appearance, could have once served as a potato sack, emerged from the thicket of reeds. Bare feet slapped on the muddy lake shore. Logan said. "Hello," he said, and swallowed nervously, because it was strange and unsettling to find a child in a deserted place between two villages. "Where are your parents? Where are the adults?" Actually, the young stranger frowned. "I'm big enough to go where I need to go on my own." I see Logan nodded, though of course nothing was clear. "What? What's wrong?" Nothing. The girl looked at him with a look that said, "Are you stupid, Uncle? I just need some help. If you can't do it yourself, you have to ask others. That's what my mom taught me. And also, of course, you have to say the important word, please. Please. Uncle, can you make me a boat?" With the last impatient word, he was handed some old sheet of paper, I think, from a drawing album. "I think I can." Logan dropped his backpack to the ground and took the sheet. But he didn't make anything from it, instead looking intently at the girl. Something about this seemed strange and wrong to him. So you're walking alone. Where do you live? There, and Chernika waved a thin hand in the direction where there was a village with a beautiful berry name. And why do you ask? The girl, having knocked a mosquito off her cheek, frowned. Are you not a bad man? Why do you want to know where I live? The young creature's suspicion was reasonable, but it came out so amusingly, coupled with the terms of their acquaintance, that Logan grinned. Don't you think it's dangerous to ask a stranger to make you a ship? Maybe I'm a really bad person? Well, that's unlikely, replied the crumb. You look like someone else. Different. The good one. The smart one. She waved her hands. Mommy calls them Tele. Intelligentsia? Logan prompted and the girl nodded. Actually, she guessed a little he was indeed a scientist and came from what could be called an intelligent family. And as for the guess, well, Logan himself knew what kind of impression he made. Tall, skinny blonde guy with glasses, often wore plaid shirts. Yeah, that's how nerds are usually portrayed in movies. But he was just being himself, and he was fine with that. As for the opinion of others, first of all, it didn't matter. And secondly, he knew how to make an impression if he had to. Thanks to his grandfather, who did not let him down and in the period of growing up brought up in such a way that sometimes I wanted to howl. Okay, I'll make you a ship, Logan said, and raised the sheet higher, going to bend it into a simple but quite buoyant figure. And before the sheet had been frayed and possibly soaked in a puddle and then dried underfoot, it was indeed a watercolor, and a pretty one at that. A skillful hand had subtly depicted a forest thicket, over which the moon had risen. It was interesting, the fact that there was an empty space in the middle of the drawing, on which some poem had been written, not with paint, but with an ink pen. The lines were blurred, frayed, one could hardly make out anything. But Logan made it out. One word, two words, and a line. Then another. And what he read. His heart skipped a beat, froze, kicked into a frantic rhythm, as if he'd been hit on the head and at the same time in the solar plexus. He felt like he was falling, and at the same time his whole body was petrified. And the thing was, he knew who had written it. He knew who those lines belonged to. And it was impossible, unthinkable, unreal. Because the person who had thought them up had been dead for years. She was dead. His sister, Helene. Where? Where did you get that from? He must have had the look of a madman, Logan thought to himself, because the girl was looking at him frightened. Except right now he couldn't stop. Where did you get that? I don't know. The poor child threw herself at her, shrieking shrilly as he swung around. Don't. Wait, I'm sorry. Calm down. It's okay, I won't hurt you, Logan rambled, but he seemed to be making it worse. I just need to know where you got it from. Who gave it to you? Tell me, I need to know. The poor girl's lips trembled. She retreated back into the rustling reeds and then, with another shriek, she ran, like a mouse scurrying through the thicket. He didn't think about what he was doing, he just rushed after her. But, after a step, his foot caught on some snags and then, barely unhooked, it got caught on the mud, and finally Logan just fell. And somehow he hit his head unluckily, because when he opened his eyes, he realized that the sun had shifted in the sky, which meant that he'd been out for hours. Just fine, he muttered grimly, struggling to get to his feet, his whole body stiff from his long immobility. He touched his head with his fingers. He didn't seem to be hurt, and probably not even concussed, although of course he should see a doctor now. In addition, his clothes were wet, soaked with the odors of Tina, stained with mud. It was logical to doubt whether they would let him on the bus in such a state at all. But the main thing was that the sheet was here, and it hadn't been blown away. Logan clutched it frantically, smoothed it out, and eagerly read the lines. No, it wasn't a mistake. It had really been written by her Helen. How strange it was to feel the touch of the past, whose doom he had long since resigned himself to. They were brother and sister, and Helene was 10 years younger. He remembered her curly, unruly hair, the color of bitter chocolate, which her mother had tried unsuccessfully to braid. He remembered her sister stomping on the parquet floor. She loved to express her joy by running around the apartment. And she knew how to be happy about everything: a cake, a new dress, a colorful butterfly seen on a walk. Memories of childhood froze in the consciousness of living photographs, brief episodes from the history of one family, which lived happily and peacefully, until everything was crossed out by a car accident. Father, Mother, and Ellen. They said the car just skidded on the road it was hailing thickly that day. It smashed through the barrier on the bridge and into the river. He was burying loved ones on the same day. Father, Mother, and an empty baby coffin. His sister's body was not found, but journalists and acquaintances were sure that it was impossible to survive. Logan did not go to the orphanage. His grandfather, Greg, stayed with him. The old man, of course, was not easy to raise a boy, but he coped, surrounded with care, practical, and became for his grandson the best friend in the world. Good pension grandfather was a professor, and lively wit helped to live well. Logan received a brilliant home education, and by the end of school, in addition to English, was fluent in French, German, and also knew Greek and Latin, because grandfather was an advocate of a kind of classical education, which was common among the children of the nobility at the beginning of the century. And this approach, it naturally had a certain impact on Logan's entire childhood, so he didn't know what it was like to run around in garages and dabble. Grandpa thought that his grandson was the last thing left of their family and tried to give him the best that he could pass on. And generally speaking, Logan was happy with his adolescence, and he got into the university his grandfather had graduated from without question. And then, Grandpa, unfortunately, wasn't forever. Having buried him 5 years ago, 26-year-old Logan could not come to terms with the departure of the only close person. Only work saved him. He went into it with his head. And when there wasn't enough work, he went to help other people. Yes, grandfather considered charity as one of the main things that every decent person should do. And Logan, true to his principles, helped homeless animals, visited old people in orphanages, donated as much as he could from his income. And in these parts near the village of Blueberry, he found himself, by the way, for the reason of charity. He visited an old woman. Her name was Darcy, and she was a former village teacher. She had children and a husband. And then, life in its saddest forms simply happened. Her retired husband passed away. Her children moved away and, having found their own families, stopped visiting their mother. True, Darcy was offered to move to a boarding school, but she stubbornly refused. Afraid of bad conditions, she flatly refused to believe that there were decent institutions. Darcy said she would live where she was born, period. In general, Grandma Darcy was strong in spirit, but in her 75 years, her health was not so good. And so, when the charity organization, where Logan was a volunteer, distributed the wards, he got her. "You are a cultured young man," said to him the head of the organization, Tamara. "You will find a common language with her, I have no doubt." And so, as fate would have it, on his way back from Darcy's, Logan decided to change his route. And now he was standing by the lake. The setting sun was blinding him, and in his hands the wind was tearing a leaf. A leaf that logically shouldn't have existed in nature. Logan sighed heavily. What should he do? He decided to go to the bus stop right now. Because tomorrow he had to go to work, and the art gallery wouldn't understand him if he didn't show up for a consultation about those gorgeous green vases. "Kate." "Daughter, what's wrong?" The young woman, wrinkled pain in the leg again played out, rose and came to her daughter, who all evening sat on the sofa, frowning, playing with teddy toys, a teddy bear and a tiger. "Who hurt her?" Anastasia asked. "No," the girl replied. "Everything. It's okay." "And I know when you are a liar," her mom told her in a mysterious tone. "Your freckles are glowing. Tell me what happened." Katenka sighed, clutched the bear tighter, and told how it was that she went to play with the village children, but they began to shout at her and throw mud. Then she decided to play by herself and went to the lake. "But that's far away. Did you even leave the village?" Her mother grabbed her by the shoulders and gave her a gentle shake. "What did I tell you? You can't do that." "I'm sorry, Mommy," the little girl said in a trembling voice. "I won't do it again." Anastasia sighed heavily. Well, what to do with her daughter? 1,000 times she repeated to her to play in the yard, in the extreme case near the house, but not like this. "Okay, I forgive you this time. But you're not going to upset me again, are you? I won't. And you won't go to the castle? Don't go there. It's a bad house. Squinted her eyes and asked Anastasia sternly. Really? Kate replied fervently. I'll never go there again. That's a good girl, smiled the girl's mother, and then, getting up, went to put tea. It was necessary to have dinner. And for dinner, well, there was one more cutlet and as much pasta as you want. Mom, don't you eat a cutlet? Here, it's healthy, there's meat. The little girl held out her plate. Thank you, darling, I've already eaten. I had a cutlet this afternoon. Anastasia lied easily. As she was accustomed to do, she was again giving the best and not at all superfluous pieces to her daughter. You eat, eat. Also, as easily as lying about her own satiety, Anastasia had learned not to cry in front of her daughter. That's the last thing she needed. Her own life stupid ruined, so yourself and suffer, and the child need a mom smiling, cheerful, kind, and caring. That's the whole story. There was no one else in their little family. Father, that creature, which Anastasia knew for sure would be too good to be called an animal, had thankfully not been around for a long time. But who could say what would happen next? He would be back soon. And so Anastasia dreaded the future. No, thank you, but I definitely can't. Yes, it's a shame, of course. No, it's fine, I'm just taking care of a few things. I'll see you Wednesday. Having rejected the offer to spend the weekend at a country recreation center with kebabs and other summer pleasures of life, Logan ended the conversation with his best friend Vincent and sighed and went to wash his face. It was a strange habit, but his grandfather was right, it was invigorating. It helped to activate his brain 100%. Logan was going to go to the village, find that strange girl, and figure out how she had gotten the drawing with the poem. His smartphone beeped a tune. It was a message that a cab had arrived. Visiting? The cab driver asked, glancing at his passenger who was tensely pensive. You could say that, Logan answered. I see, he nodded. In this weather only to visit the city. It's the best time then. I'm often here. It's good when orders are out of town than to breathe in the summer, isn't it? You come here often? Logan suddenly lively. Well, in this area, explained the cab driver. There's a cottage community nearby, which means that not everyone has their own transportation. My name is Ben, by the way. Logan. Do you know who lives in the village of Blueberry? Well, actually, my brother-in-law has a cousin who lives here. In general, a distant relative. It's not a bad village, but there are all sorts of people, of course. You know, Logan began cautiously. Isn't there? And he tried to describe the girl he had met at the lake. What are you interested in? The cabbie squinted. It seemed to me that the child. Logan sighed. He knew from experience that in many situations it was better to tell the truth as much as possible. Anyway, I met her quite far from the village, and he shared that he thought the child was obviously from a dysfunctional family, and since he himself was no stranger to charity, it might be possible to help. So that's Anastasia's daughter, exclaimed the cab driver. They are well known here. Yes, it's a poor family. What do you mean? Logan asked, and the cabbie, clearly satisfied that he wasn't starved for conversation on the road, began to tell the story. It turned out that Anastasia was an orphan. She came to the village about 8 years ago, or rather she was brought by a local resident, Nick. He was a complicated man himself. He drank, served time, was a bully. And then he brought his wife from the city. And it was no secret that Anastasia had sold her apartment with Nick's encouragement. He promised her that with the money they'd renovate the village house and set up a farm, and they'd live. But that money soon disappeared. Nick lost it just like that, lost it in a card game and drank it. But Anastasia stayed with him. And where could she go now, homeless and in an interesting position? They started to live somehow. They had a child, a daughter. We lived badly, very badly. Sometimes, though, about twice a year, Nick tried to get out of his poor state. He quit drinking and tried to go to Darcy Botke. But it all ended in the same way. Nick came back with little left over from Darbabotka, if he got paid at all, even angrier than he was, and went back to the bottle. But 2 years ago, things got worse. The thing was, Anastasia had tried to leave him. It had been a big scandal, and the neighbors had come running. But then Nick announced that they had reconciled. But Anastasia stopped going out for some reason. They hadn't seen her for 3 months. Then she came out. And the neighbors were shocked. Because it turned out that she fell awkwardly, and no one doubted, by the way, that it happened when Nick came at her with his fists. Anyway, Anastasia fell and broke her leg. The fracture was complex, so the doctors did not turn. And when she turned, it was a little too late. And that's how the young woman became lame. And naturally, in such a state, when she became an invalid, she had no prospects to leave and take the child. That's the story, summarized the cab driver. So if you have the opportunity, you should help them by all means. Anastasia is a good woman, and her daughter is just beautiful, and you can't tell that the father is such a frame. It's very picturesque here, said Logan, who was feeling a little creepy about the whole thing. Yeah, I could use these views on a postcard. Ben grinned. It seems like a simple village, Chernica, but it has its own attractions. Take the castle, for instance. Castle? Logan raised an eyebrow. Really? Well, it's just for show, the cab driver waved his hand. But it's a remarkable structure. From here, from the road, you won't see it, and there is no it in Chernica itself. But if you go into the forest, you see it's a wedge. It's there, a couple of kilometers away, so there it is. Some bandit built it in the 90s. Well, that's what people say. The architecture, you know, is remarkable. All those turrets, red brick, lancet windows, all so gloomy. What do you call it? Gothic, Logan said. Oh yeah. I've heard of it, the cabbie nodded. What is it? Are these your local haunted ruins? Logan smiled. No, it's residential, said Ben. He turned the steering wheel deftly to avoid a huge pig lying in the middle of the road, a heavy downpour the day before, and the animal was lounging in a deep puddle. Oh, pig, that's it. No understanding of the rules of behavior on the road, huh? So this. He returned to the main topic. There's an old man who lives in this castle. His name is Dan Galbraith. He used to be a big man. It was his son who built this house, I think. And then his son disappeared. I'm telling you, he was a bandit, and such people don't live long. Anyway, the old man lived alone. His wife is long gone. Loneliness is a terrible thing. He lives alone there. When he goes out for groceries, he goes back to his place. He mumbles something to himself. He used to be an artist selling paintings, a man of art, and there he was. He didn't save the beautiful from lunacy, it turns out. They drove in silence for a few minutes, each one immersed in his own thoughts. You asked about ghosts, said Ben. There are ghosts, too, by the way. They say a lot of things about this castle, he said, lowering his voice. That on some nights you can hear beautiful women singing in the woods. And some people have seen it with their own eyes. How under the moonlight a maiden figure in a white dress, an ancient one, walks on the roof of a house. They say Ben glanced at Logan. They say it's the soul of the old man's first love visiting him, and that one day it'll drag him straight to the other side. You've got a lot of local folklore here, Logan smiled. Naturally, he took the cab driver's story about 10% seriously, but he was glad he'd had this conversation. It helped take his mind off what was coming. Logan asked to pull over at the beginning of the street. He didn't want to drive up to the gate of Anastasia's house and draw attention to himself. After paying, he wished the cabbie good luck and said goodbye. Now came the hard part. He wouldn't be surprised if the lady of the house refused to let him in, or would let him down a vicious dog. There was no dog in the yard, by the way, and it looked as if no animals were kept here. From the wicket gate, one could see the barn from afar, where there was only a void, and the warped door methodically swaying in the wind. Good afternoon, Logan said when Anastasia came out of the yard to his knocking. And excuse me, is anyone home calls? Excuse me, I need to talk to you. My name is Logan Turner. You see, He stammered, though he was usually known for his eloquence, which, by the way, had helped him more than once. But now, it was strange, but it was as if he had plunged underwater when he saw her, Anastasia. This young woman seemed to him monstrously haggard and lovely at the same time. She was poorly dressed and moved with difficulty, with a limp on her left leg, but she held herself with remarkable dignity, and her slightly slanted, feline green eyes were shrewd and wary. Taking a deep breath, Logan decided once again that the truth was the most reliable route. He said that he was a volunteer for a charitable organization, and that he'd happened to meet Anastasia's daughter on his way back from a ward, and it just so happened that he'd thought that her family might need help. "We're not beggars," Anastasia replied. "We don't need anything, thank you. I can take care of my daughter." It sounded as if the young woman feared more than anything that she would be accused of not being able to take care of her daughter, or even tried to take her child away for it. "Thank you, of course," she added, shivering as she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, though the thermometer was definitely over 25 degrees. It was strange, but she didn't feel a wave of wary apprehension at the sight of the young man, a familiar part of her perception of reality. "Thank you," she repeated, "but we never with any charities." "All right," he nodded. "Don't worry, please. It's not my purpose to intrude," much less she widened her eyes at those words because he seemed to read her mind. "To interfere in any way with you and your daughter's lives, as if you were a bad mother. I understand your concerns, and I can assure you that the choice is yours alone, and if you say so, I will leave now. I'm not taking hidden photos or videos or recording audio right now. Don't worry about that. Our communication is confidential. But I have to ask you one thing." He took a deep breath, as if he was preparing to dive into the water. "And that's the second thing that brought me here." This he unfolded a sheet of paper, carefully kept in the pocket of his clothes since it had been found. "Her daughter. She asked me to make a paper boat out of it, and I'm not bad at boats, but it's very important for me to know where she got it from." Anastasia made a vague sound, a confused, wary hum, and shifted her gaze from Logan to the sheet and back again. "The thing is, this leaf. Anyway, it seems to have something to do with someone important to me." Anastasia, pulling her shawl tighter around her, hummed again, bit her lip, and it was clear from the concentrated look on her face that she was making a decision that would be final. "It's not from my daughter's sketchbook," she said at last. "Kate draws well, but not like this. And not from our books. Come in." She stepped aside. "Daughter Kate, we have guests." Catherine, who sat at the table on a stool, rounded her eyes and it seems could squeal, as then at the lake, but immediately changed her mind. There was a mother, and she said that they have guests. "Did the guests buy a cake?" she blurted out. "Kate, shame on you. You can't do that." "Excuse her," she said guiltily to Logan. "It's all right," he smiled. The child had just reminded him of the commonplace norms of politeness. "But unfortunately, I don't have the cake on me right now. Tell me, is your daughter allowed chocolate?" he asked quietly, leaning toward Anastasia. "Yes," she answered and nearly flinched. But not from the unpleasant sensation. On the contrary, it was so strange, but as he approached, she felt a cloud of peace and warmth and tranquility envelop her. And then the thought, which she realized was totally inappropriate, that this man, he seemed so caring and kind. "Then allow me to present young Princess of Meadows and Lakes." With a joking half-bow, Logan took out of his backpack, with which he never parted in the city, and all the trips a box of chocolates. Generally, their charity organization did not accept very expensive material aid, but now he was acting on his own behalf, and so he chose premium candies with natural composition from Magadarcy. Katinka gasped because it was the first time she had seen such beauty up close. "I'll put the tea on," Anastasia said. And yet it was very strange. Anastasia was not used to being frank with people, and lately she had felt cut off from the world. But with this young man, it was easy and simple to talk, as if there were none of the bad things that had twisted, confused, and broken her life in recent years. And in about 15 minutes, Logan knew in general terms that mom and daughter lived alone, and dad and husband, he was far away now. An experience combined with natural instinct, and even against the background of the cab driver's story. All this made Logan realize that everything was not easy with this man. Kate seemed to be afraid of him, and Anastasia was not looking forward to him either. "The doctors say it's bad," Anastasia said, touching her foot timidly, shyly, shamefully, with her fingertips. "But there are medical mistakes, aren't there? So I have faith in the best. I'll go for treatment soon, for sure. I have to take care of my daughter. Lev, well, right?" The last was said exaggeratedly cheerful, so that it was clear that this young woman did not believe that she would be helped, but was afraid to admit her helplessness. Logan told a little about himself, what he did, and everything. And then finally the conversation flowed in the right direction. "Honey, where did you get that piece of paper, please?" Anastasia asked. "I don't remember." Kate looked away, her lower lip hanging out. "I just found it." "What if Mom doesn't swear?" Anastasia stroked her daughter's head. "Sweetie, Uncle Logan really needs to know where you got it. It's very important." "Why?" "It's his job." Anastasia composed as she walked. Katenka, sighing, sent another candy into her mouth. She was already covered in chocolate up to her nose. "I really found it," the girl said, "on the road. A breeze brought it." From the castle, she whispered at the end and glanced apprehensively around. Anastasia sighed convulsively. "Honey, well, what did I say about the castle? No, I'm not scolding you. It's just. So it was lying in a clearing near it." "Yes, the wind brought it. Over the fence." The girl went on telling, "Mom, it's not my fault. The village boys made me do it. They said I was a coward, and they said they were going to listen to the ghost. And I went too. Because I'm not a coward. I'm already called a bum, an invalid's daughter. But I'm not a coward." Oh, Anastasia hugged her daughter, and that protective gesture of tenderness made Logan's heart ache. "Of course you're not a coward. You're my bravest. But, honey, you're a big girl, aren't you?" "Well, what ghosts?" "It was there," Kate whispered. "It's there. I saw it walking in the garden." "Wait," Logan interrupted. "That's the second time I've heard that. You see, while I was getting here," and he relayed his conversation with the cab driver. "They say all sorts of things," Anastasia said thoughtfully. "But everyone knows that the old man lives alone. I don't know how he takes care of his garden, but everything seems to be blooming beautifully. But ghosts? Well, you don't believe in that nonsense, do you?" No, Logan shook his head. They talked some more. Then Logan said he had to go, and before he left, he ventured to ask her if there was anything he could do to help. There wouldn't be any paperwork to fill out, no need to drive somewhere or talk to other people either. "Thank you, but no." Anastasia sighed, but he hesitated. She was clearly hesitating. "No, we'll manage." "Okay, but take this." He held out his phone number to her. "And if you need anything, or just want to talk, call me." Theoretically, he could and should have gone home, but Logan thought that since he was here, it might be a good idea to stop by Darcy's grandmother's house, because her blood pressure had been bad recently, so he should check on her. And by the way, she seemed to have a wobbly window sash. He'd noticed it the last time he'd been here, so it would be a quick fix. The weather was warm, but not sweltering, so it was a relatively easy drive to the next village. And on the way he pondered. Perhaps he had fantasized? Perhaps it was just a similar poem? After all, even novels sometimes, strangers to each other writers write the same, and there is not a drop of plagiarism in it, because the ideas, as they say, hover in the air. Anything is possible. Logan decided he had to meet the mysterious owner of the castle house in the woods and talk to him about it. Ellen in her 5 was unusually gifted and could draw well, at the level of a teenager already drawing with watercolors and colored pencils. Her parents said that she had a huge talent, and she was a little genius. The girl also composed poems, but since she could hardly still write, they were written down for her by adults. His brain had already invented a logical explanation. Surely this man just knew his sister once. Perhaps he had worked at the daycare center Ellen had gone to, or maybe at the art school where his sister was taken. And then years later, the man himself decided to take up art. Yes, such an explanation was quite logical, that this old man was simply inspired years later by what he had seen from the little prodigy. Anything was better than that crazy thoughts about who else could have drawn and written it. Because it was time to recognize and accept his sister was dead. Sighing, Logan threw back his head and walked for a while, looking up at the sky, at the floating clouds, enough of being crazy, of catching illusions. It was time to accept it. Finally, he calmed down. On the way to Darcy's, of course, he had to stop at the magician's shop to buy some food, because it would be unseemly to come to his ward empty-handed. Grandma Darcy Logan called from the fence. The window above the Pamilidnik was ajar, the wind fluttering the white tulle curtains, so Darcy must have heard the visitor. She did so she looked out, splayed her hands because she hadn't expected to see him. Next time he wasn't due until a week later and then appeared on the porch. Logan. What a surprise. She had lost her teeth long ago, but her smile was warm and charming, and her eyes shone like a young woman's. I thought I'd come by and see you, Logan smiled back. The window, I remember, should be repaired. Well, the old woman nodded. But she was acting a little strange. She didn't call me to the house. As usual, she just stood there. I'm sorry, it's just, I have a guest. A guest? Well, that's good, Logan said, a little surprised because Baba Darcy was known to be an unsociable person. An old acquaintance of mine. Used to work for him, the old woman explained, and she was a talkative person. A colleague from school? No, Darcy waved her hands. Private lessons. I know German and French as well as my subject. I gave lessons to his granddaughter. Granddaughter? Clarified Logan, who had a hound dog's instinct that Darcy's mysterious guest was probably not an ordinary man. Well, like me, he's a bit of a stranger, the old woman said with a guilty look. I see, Logan said. Is this a bad time? No, it's okay. I understand. And I'm not offended at all. Here you go. He handed her a bag of groceries. Then I'd better get going. No, come on. Come in, I won't chase you away. The old woman got worried. Dan was about to leave. You just wait a bit, okay? She asked, and went back inside. Logan leaned against the fence and looked at the flowers. Lush peonies in all shades of pink. He glanced up to see an old man coming down the porch. Yes, it was an old man in the classic sense of the word. He wore a light-colored suit, cloth shoes, new but clearly vintage, as well as a light-colored hat. He had an oaky, snow-white beard and long hair down to the middle of his neck. The old man, glaring back at Logan, quite unpleasantly, by the way, walked down the road. Logan entered the house. He went straight to fixing the window, which was easy. What colorful acquaintances you have, he said, by the way. One look at that grandfather and it seems as if he had traveled to us in a time machine from the 30s. Dan is a truly extraordinary man, and I'm proud to know him, Darcy said. He has given a lot, sacrificed a lot for his vocation. Oh, he's had his share. Darcy's story was a little rambling, but Logan quickly grasped the gist of it. It turned out that when he was young, Dan had been in love with a beautiful actress who had given up her career for him. They dreamed of having a daughter, but unfortunately a son had been born. The doctors said it was dangerous to try again, but they'd tried, believing that their love would be repaid. But the beautiful wife died in the second labor. They couldn't save their daughter either. Dan had to become a single father. He never married again, and he kept women away from him. He always lamented the fact that he had a son. He thought that if he had a daughter, she would be the ideal, his little princess. But his son, he didn't live up to his hopes and became a terrible man, a bandit. And then, when he died too, Dan broke down, withdrew into himself, became a hermit. He only went into town once in a while, or visited her Darcy, an old acquaintance. Wait, Logan frowned. Did he live alone, or did he have a girl? So this is the same Dan who lives in the woods. Well, Darcy's grandmother sobbed softly. My long tongue. I shouldn't have said that. I promised I wouldn't say anything. But you, Logan, you're like a grandson to me. So I had to share. Before you, they came to me. Oh, old age. One of them came to me and kept telling me to sign the house over to her and the power of attorney for my pension. And you're kind, so you're talking, old woman. Babs, Darcy, what are you saying? Don't cry, Logan comforted her, and hastily brewed her favorite soothing tea with chamomile and lime. Finally, Darcy calmed down. Yes, he had a girl, she continued. When was the last time I saw her? 2 or 3 years ago? Lovely girl. Dan said she was a guest of his. I taught her languages, and how she plays music. Piano, violin, harp, Brett. Can you believe it? She sings like a nightingale. He told me later that she left. Well, of course. Yes, she was a nice girl. Only strange. What do you mean, weird? Logan asked. Well, how to explain? The old woman thought, like a little bit out of our world, you know. She was so pure. Naive. She looked at me as if I were a wonder. She asked me how I was living there. I asked her, where is it? And she, well, in general, as if. She was alien to our reality. We didn't talk much. I taught her, that's all. Dan, he's a good man. But he didn't like it when I started talking outside the subject. That's just it. Logan frowned. All the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in his head. Logan, where are you going? Darcy watched confused as he picked up his backpack. I gotta go, Darcy. Thanks. Thanks for the story. Logan dashed down the road out of the village. Darcy said Dan was walking. Given what the cabbie had said about the location of the house in the woods, it looked like he couldn't have gotten very far with the old man's leisurely pace. Logan took off at a run. And actually he was doing it running, but now it was not a measured movement, when on his arm a digital device, counting kilometers, steps and pulse. Now he was just running, so that it was painful to catch his breath. He stopped only when he noticed the figure of the old man ahead. He noticed it, and he ducked, slipped into the tall bushes by the road, hiding behind them. Yes, he could have caught up and talked right now, but for some reason he couldn't explain this reason to himself. He decided to talk to Dan when he reached home. And the old man didn't notice the tail. Here he entered the forest along a barely noticeable path. It seemed to Logan that he would notice him, as the branches broke under his feet and everything rustled. But Dan must have been hard of hearing, as Darcy had said. The old man must have walked for about an hour. And then, the trees parted, revealing a large clearing. On one side of the clearing ran into a low place where a stream, or rather a small rivulet, flowed. And here stood a house. It was small, but it looked majestic. Light stone in different shades, skillful masonry. Yes, this building really looked like a castle. And it was clear from the first glance it was very dilapidated. How had that ornamental tower, for example, not collapsed yet? There were only 2 floors, and on the first floor Logan noticed that all the windows had bars. There was a small garden near the house, and in it you could feel. The work was skillful, and frequent roses were blooming here. The alpine hill was full of hyacinths. There was a green arbor, and under a spreading oak tree swings were swinging. As for the fence, it was a strange combination brick and steel bars. And besides, in some places the fence was in need of repair. The old man stopped at a rusty wrought iron gate, took a large key out of his pocket, and rustled it open. Logan froze, hiding behind some horribly thorny bush. It was now or never, but he hesitated, because he didn't know what to say. For some reason it seemed to him that this grandfather was not as safe as he thought, and was not at all eager to talk openly to strangers. Logan sighed. He must be wrong. I mean, he should talk to Dan, but not like this. Definitely go back to Darcy. Tell her everything, and through her he could meet the mysterious hermit. Logan was about to leave, starting to turn, but the old man, who was about to lock the gate on the other side, suddenly groaned, clutched his heart, and slumped to the sandy path. Logan rushed to him. Grandfather. He called out, bending down. Check his pulse. Yes, no convulsions, eyes closed. Grabbing the phone, the guy swore there was no connection. But maybe it was the woods. Maybe he should have gone inside, he thought. Of course, it was doubtful that there would be a landline phone there, but at least there should be a first aid kit. He should bring Dan to his senses, give him some medicine, tell him what he was taking, and then run to the village, to the edge of the forest, to call an ambulance. The old man, despite his short stature and thinness, was unusually heavy. Logan's hands trembled as he searched his pockets for keys and unlocked the door of the house. Then, panting with effort, he carried the pensioner inside. The hallway, the door. The living room with the couch. It fit. Having unloaded Dan, Logan looked around. Well, where does he keep the first aid kit? In general, the house looked a little better from the inside than it did from the outside. But it looked as if he'd been through a time machine. Parquet floors, carpeting, massive carved wooden furniture, a huge floor clock, a plush upholstered set, bookshelves, a lamp with a green shade, gold-framed paintings on the walls, a collection of china and a collection of crystal on long shelves, a fireplace, now unlit. Hey, Dan. Logan leaned over the old man because he groaned and wiggled. Dan, where's the first aid kit? What kind of medicine do you need? Don't be scared, please. My name is Logan. I want to help you. Grandpa. Who are you? And what are you doing to my grandfather? A ringing female voice made him flinch and turn around with a jagged movement, and then Logan opened his eyes in shock, because in the doorway, there she stood. A tall maiden no older than 16. Dark, curly hair scattered loosely over her shoulders. She was wearing a dress, and it was immediately clear a retro outfit in the fashion of the 20s, perhaps, in her face. Logan recognized it immediately, and yet she was a stranger. He could have sworn she was practically a carbon copy of his mother in her youth. The same nose, gray eyes, cheeks. She looked horrified, confused. She looked at him as if she was seeing something amazing and yet threatening for the first time. Logan, hearing his own voice as a stranger, delicately began to explain that Dan had become ill. It seems with the heart, and he wanted to help. Wait a minute. The girl rushed to the secretary, rustled in it, and took out a first aid kit, an ancient-looking box. Here. Heart drops. She named the dosage and poured water from a carafe into a glass. Logan helped to lift up Dan, who was coming to himself and shaking like an aspen leaf. I'll go now. I need to get out of the woods. There's no cell reception here. I'll call an ambulance. The girl frowned, bit her lip, nodded, and sat down on the edge of the couch, took the old man's hand. I'm with Grandpa. Grandpa? I'm here. Logan felt like he was floating in weightlessness and falling into the abyss at the same time. His thoughts, now, were flitting frantically, looking like stars ready to turn to nothing under the influence of dark matter. He had to ask her. He had to tell her. And only the fact that the old man was still sick, a large shiver began to hit him, forced him to grasp with a willful effort the part of reality that really mattered now. Logan, without another word, rushed out of the house. On his way out of the woods, he fell. He didn't even notice. He flew to the edge of the forest, grabbed his cell phone, got a connection. Now call an ambulance. And then, slowly he went back. He's asleep, the stranger told him when he entered the house. His heart hurts, he said. Logan froze in the doorway. He felt strange, as if one wrong move could destroy everything, make the house, the old man and the girl, and at the same time himself, crumble into billions of pieces like a broken kaleidoscope. The girl, meanwhile, rose and approached him with a light, dancing gait. She bowed her head and regarded him. Logan, on the other hand, stared back. Are you human? She blurted out and bounced away, palms pressed to her mouth and a sly look on her face. Yes, Logan nodded. What do you mean? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you, but human. The girl shrieked and jumped, as if she'd learned something so important. I knew it. I knew there were more of you. You. No horns, no tail, no claws. Not there either, right? She nodded at his shoes, and Logan, unable to comprehend anything at all, nodded. And your eyes don't glow. And you? Who are you, she asked, reaching out and poking him gently in the shoulder with her finger. My name is Logan, he answered. I'm volunteer. A what? I help people. I work for free for a charity organization. Why, he took in more air to quell the hysteria that was coming on. Who are you? Grandpa's princess. Simply but proudly answered the girl. My name is Amali. Why? Were you leaving? I didn't understand. To call an ambulance. There was no cell phone reception. Telly. What? What is an ambulance and why call it? It's a smartphone. A cell phone, Logan explained, and a very bad suspicion began to creep into his head. An ambulance is a service that heals people. Amelie, tell me, why did you ask me if I'm human? Because Grandpa says that people are gone, only he and I are left, whispered this young girl, and it seemed like a child sharing a terrible secret. But I read the books he hid, and the newspapers. They say there are people. That's true, Logan nodded. Oh, she splashed her hands. Grandpa. Why did he say that? Why did he say there were no people left? I don't know. I don't know him very well. You see, I came here to meet him. You did. You came to visit. The girl clapped her hands. Oh, why didn't Grandpa tell me? I would have made a cake. We don't have any guests. Only Grandma Darcy came, but she's a beast. Darcy's an animal? Logan had a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. Well, yes. The squirrel kindly explained. Grandfather said she was kind. Because he pays her in golden nuts. Baba Darcy taught me languages. That used to exist in the world. She was kind. And she always wore a hat. But it's etiquette for a lady to do so. Of course. Grandfather said she'd take her hat off, but she was ashamed of her squirrel ears. And he wouldn't tell me to talk to her about it. I didn't. I was curious, by the way. Amelie stomped her foot in her manner, together with her gestures and other details, but gave away. That her behavior had a lot of the behavior of a small child. Logan's heart clenched uneasily. He began to realize that the poor girl seemed to have problems with her head. The old man on the couch groaned again, coming to his senses, and tried to sit up. You, get out. Get out. Dan clearly wanted to yell, but he was whispering. Speech was hard to come by. Logan rushed to him again and started saying that no, he didn't mean any harm. He was only trying to help. He was sorry. I don't need an ambulance, the old man wheezed and grimaced as if in pain and pressed his hand to his heart again. By myself somehow. You have all the signs of a heart attack, Logan said sternly. But you're an adult, of course, and you can decide for yourself. If you want, I'll go and cancel the call. Cancel it. Only. He nodded at Amelie, who had moved to the other end of the room, turned on the gramophone, and began to dance and hum softly, holding the hem of her dress with her fingertips. If you die. Your pupil, I don't know who she is. What will happen to her if you die, have you thought? Dan's expression changed from angry and indignant to frightened and confused. The old man's lips trembled. What have I done, he whispered, lying back down obediently. Oh, Amelie, what have I done? But who are you? And why did you? I saw you at Darcy's house. Why did you follow me? You followed her. My little princess. Why would you say that? A cold sweat ran down Logan's back. Why would I or anyone else come after your Amelie? Because I always knew that one day she'd be taken from me, the old man sighed wistfully. I knew that one day it would all end, but I meant well. A knock on the door distracted him from the conversation. Logan went to open the door, and it was the EMTs. Amelie froze when she heard the voices of strangers. Oh, I can't. People. More people. She squeaked and rushed out of the living room, ran up the stairs to the second floor. The door slammed. Who's sick? Your father? The ambulance doctor asked, peering warily into the corridor. She'd been on many different calls. But this one in a forested area in a strange house that looked like a museum was definitely one of the strangest. No, a friend of mine, Logan answered. A heart attack, I think, but it's not acute. You sound confident, the woman snorted. Are you a doctor? No, I'm a volunteer. I took a first aid course as he led the doctor into the living room. Logan thought tiredly that everything that was happening to him was out of control. And he felt like a character in a movie scripted by a man with a lot of imagination. The doctor examined Dan, measured his blood pressure. She said that it was necessary to go to the hospital, and even more so, one should not neglect regular checkups, as the old man admitted the last time he had been to the polyclinic was about 10 years ago. But Dan resolutely refused to be hospitalized, saying that it was nothing. He would drink tea with forest herbs and feel better immediately. You know, the doctor said to Logan before she left, you should talk to him about how you can't do that. Indeed, all these herbs harden yourself by pouring cold water, exercise, it's all great. But the achievements of modern medicine should not be neglected. When the door closed behind the doctor and the ambulance left, Logan felt trapped again. During his time as a volunteer, he had met all kinds of people, sometimes very strange. But what was going on in this house was outrageous. That was what his intuition told him. Young man, the old man called out to him. Your name is Logan, isn't it? Yes, he answered. "Sit down, we need to talk," Dan said, and when Logan sat down, he looked at him carefully. "Up until today, I thought everything was fine. No, I'm not crazy and I didn't think I was immortal. But I thought I still had time, time to make things right." Logan nodded, though he still didn't understand anything. But he was in no hurry to ask questions. He needed to hear what this man had to say first. He needed to use this as a basis, a framework for what he could ask himself. Otherwise, Logan felt like he was going to go crazy then. And then Dan spoke. He said that the last years of his voluntary recluse had been full of peace and anxiety, which he had kept to himself. Out of fear, because he had nothing to protect himself from it. He had sought solace in the books of the wise philosophers of the past, but they, alas, could offer nothing to ease his mental anguish. But everything changed today, overnight. And when Dan felt ill, he suddenly realized with nightmarish clarity how fragile his life was. "Do you believe in fate, young man? Fate? Karma? Providence?" "I'm afraid I can't answer that question." Neither negative nor positive, Logan admitted. Dan continued. He said that for years he'd been in contact with an extremely small number of people. Darcy, another other person in town that he paid to make necessary purchases, groceries and such. Another necessary person. And I must point out, please, this is important, that these two were not aware of what I had done. They didn't know. They didn't know the truth about Amelie. "The truth," Logan said deftly. "And what did you do?" "No, wait. I didn't tell you why I came here." "That's true," Dan blinked, squinting his eyes. "But I understand that you followed me from Darcy's house and found me at the gate. So you were my accidental savior, and yet it was no accident. So what brought you here?" This Logan pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and unfolded it. "This. Found it near the gate of your house. And this. The thing is this. A drawing and a poem. A long time ago, something like this came out of my sister's hand. She died a long time ago as a child. And then I saw it and I just wanted to understand how you got it. I thought, maybe you once knew my family, my sister, and you yourself. At your leisure, you did some creative work, reproduced what you had seen, what you had read. You see," Logan paused for a moment, sighed heavily, rubbed his face with his palms, and smiled guiltily. "I think I'm going crazy, because your pupil, I think I've seen her somewhere, and once before, and I'm sorry, I'm talking out of my ass. So it's really fate," Dan said thoughtfully. "To think, after all these years. No, young man, you're not the least bit crazy. And you. It's just wonderful that you've come. And believe me, old man, all you need is this. Just listen to what I have to say." And Dan spoke. He was born into an intelligent family. His mother taught literature. His father was a restorer of expensive antiques. Dan's childhood and youth were cloudless. The family lived in a nice apartment, had 2 cars and a country house. Life was abundant. Everything was fine. Dan decided not to deviate from family traditions and decided to study history in order to teach at the university. "Wait," Logan exclaimed when the old man said his last name. "So these are your works. I have your books at home. Are you interested in history, in the narrow topic of the Viking Age and its influence on the Great Silk Road?" Dan raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were a volunteer." "It's more like my second occupation," Logan answered. "I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself," and he briefly described his education, his present profession as an art historian, and his grandfather's business of studying the history of the early Middle Ages. "So you're capable of understanding me," Dan grinned. "To realize how alien the real world can be to people like us, people of history and art." Logan shook his head. He understood what Dan was talking about, but he couldn't accept it 100%. But he was familiar with it, the desire to immerse himself in his work, mostly cutting himself off from the real world with its vanity and problems. It was so salutary and at the same time, as his grandfather had warned him, dangerous, because you could miss something important in real life, not take the main thing from life, forget about the attention you should give to your loved ones. Then came love. Dan continued his story with a sigh. "Do you know this wonderful feeling, young man?" "No, but I have experienced it to the fullest. And I will say this love is a great gift, but it can also hurt, destroy. I was unlucky. I lost the woman I love. Dan repeated what Darcy had said about him earlier. He lost his wife, and then his son went down a crooked path. You know, they say that real crazy people don't admit that they're sick. Dan grinned bitterly. What about when you know you're sick, but you don't want to, can't do anything about it? It's like not going to. Pull out a rotting tooth. So I'm getting to the point. Will you pour me some water, young man? My throat was dry. Logan handed the old man a glass of water and he continued. Then, shortly after his son's funeral, Dan turned to a secluded lifestyle. At first, he just commuted to work to the university, but he stopped socializing with acquaintances, relatives. Then he quit his job, deciding that it was quite possible to live on his pension, as well as savings that remained, plus, if necessary, you could always sell something from his extensive collection of antiques. Dan began to live on his own. It was wonderful, magical. He could escape into books for whole days. But also, he was increasingly visited by thoughts of what could things have turned out differently. What would have happened if his wife hadn't died? What would have happened if she had given birth to a daughter instead of a son? What would have happened if the daughter had lived? Dan began to suffer from insomnia. He would often leave the house and walk for hours at a time, in all kinds of weather. And one day after a storm, he went for a walk to the river. And there on the bank he found a child. It was a little girl, and she was barely alive. Dan brought her to him. At first he wanted, of course, just to warm the little girl up and take her to the doctors, to some rescuers, but then he turned on the TV. The reporter was talking about a car accident that had just happened, which had claimed the lives of 2 adults and one child, whose body was supposedly carried away by the river. Dan realized that it was the same girl. He was shocked. So this little girl had survived the fall from the bridge in the car, had not drowned, and had been found by him. Was it a coincidence or a sign of fate? He looked at her, a lovely child sleeping by the fireplace. The glow of the flames played on her ruddy apple cheeks. Her dark eyelashes fluttered slightly. Dan, getting cold, remembered what the little girl had said to him when she had come to herself for a moment there on the riverbank, and now he began to wake her gently. "Sweet girl, my little princess." He smiled at her. "Tell me, do you remember anything?" "No," said the little girl and looked around the room with a very serious look. "And this? Who is this?" she asked, pointing her finger at the portrait of Dan's wife. It was a huge painting hanging over the fireplace. "Beautiful aunt." "Is she the queen?" asked the girl, because Dan's wife was depicted here in an ancient dress. "Well, you could say that," Dan answered and stroked the girl's head. That's your mommy, baby girl, and she's dead, and I'm your grandfather." Dan told the story of what had happened before, how he saw it as a sign of fate and decided to keep the girl. He decided that this was a gift from fate, a chance to have the daughter he never had. But Dan also realized that there was one major pitfall in his plan, an obstacle, a threat that could ruin everything. The thing was that he had learned that the girl had family left behind, a grandfather and an older brother, which meant that no one would allow Dan to adopt the little girl. And then, as Dan admitted, he made that fateful decision. Out of fear of losing little Amelie, he named her after his dead wife. And also remembering what the cruel outside world had turned his son into, corrupting, twisting him into a monster, Dan decided that this girl, she must not know the outside world. She must not become another victim of it. And Dan presented her with a new reality, in which by a strange decision he presented his own dead wife as his daughter, and the little girl he had found as his granddaughter. And so Amelie became a recluse. Dan realized that raising a child, a girl alone, is not easy. But the difficulties did not stop him. He bought books about raising children. He spared no money to ensure that the little girl had toys, a dress, and good food all year round. His own education and skills as a teacher allowed him to make sure that she was developing according to the norms of her age and even ahead of her peers. And the fact that she was deprived of communication with her peers and people in general. Yes, Dan understood how bad it was, but he saw it as a forced sacrifice and a reasonable value for Amelie's safety, physical, mental, and moral. Time passed. The girl grew up. Dan admitted that he had been very lucky all these years, because Amelie had never once been really seriously ill. So he had never had to go to the doctors, who would certainly have asked too many questions. They might have guessed something and, yes, That was Dan's main fear, that one day his Amelie would be taken away from him. Also, he was well aware that as she grew older, she would have questions about why she wasn't allowed to go anywhere, about what goes on outside the house. So Dan decided to take action. He began to tell Amelie stories that once there were people in the world, but then a meteorite flew in, a new sun rose in the sky, and everything changed. People disappeared, remained very last, and they are scattered across the continents. And inhabit this world now other creatures, half beasts, half people, who came to our reality from another world. And you cannot, in any case, go out to them, because among them there are many predators, and they can destroy a normal person. And the books that Amelie read, fiction, history, textbooks, from Dan's words, they all described that, disappeared, former reality. And you? Did you think she'd believe all that? Logan asked. What the old man was telling him, he couldn't get his head around, because it was the revelation of a madman, literally a maniac, and a maniac with a sophistication rarely seen. Logan could hardly realize this fact, that in his desire to find a relative and never to lose him, this old man had crossed the line beyond which madness met him, and he dived into it joyfully, dragging the innocent Amelie with him. No, Helene. Yes, now Logan knew for sure that this girl, so kind and naive, whose mind had been ruthlessly destroyed, that she was his sister. I was afraid that she would want to check it out for herself, the old man answered pitifully. So, I didn't bring newspapers to the house. She didn't know the telephone either. And also, I gave her sedatives, antidepressants. What? Logan was ready to strangle him with his own hands. Do you realize what you've done? You made her crazy. You know, we were waiting for her, me and my grandfather, my normal grandfather. Logan jumped up and started pacing around the room. We waited. We never gave up hope that one day she'd be found, that she'd come back to us. We waited for so many years. And my grandfather, as he was dying, he told me that I mustn't lose faith. I must keep on hoping. And now, he was right. Dan smiled at the corners of his lips. Now you know everything. What am I supposed to do with this information? I don't know, Dan sighed. I'm just really afraid that if something happens to me, she's just a kid. She can't survive in the big world. After what you did to her, Logan said snidely. Oh yes, of course. She definitely can't. I want to ask you, Dan whispered, his fingers frantically clutching the blanket that covered him. Have mercy. Don't take Amelie away now. Do you want me to leave my sister with you? With a psycho? She's all I have. Dan closed his eyes. But if I'm gone, when that happens, then please take care of her. And then Dan was silent, and his hand relaxed and slipped down. Dan had never swore profanely in his life, but now he really wanted to do it because the damned old man, who turned out to be a crazy maniac, had lost consciousness again. Apparently, he had refused hospitalization in vain. What a day this is, Logan exclaimed, instead of the rich palette of other words he wanted to say, and rushed out of the house. A run to the woods, a call. A new call, and his pleas to come as soon as possible, to which he was told that of course that's how you go to the sick. And then, when the ambulance arrived and Dan was brought to his senses, then he finally agreed to be taken away. Grandpa. Amelie ran down the stairs and rushed to the stretcher where the old man lay. No, don't take him away. I won't let you. The poor girl was crying. You'll give him to the beasts. Young lady, please don't interfere. One of the doctors tried to talk some sense into her. What animals? We're taking your grandfather to the hospital. Amelie. Dan grabbed his granddaughter's hand. They met eyes. I love you, my girl. I'm sorry. I lied to you. About the world around you. About a lot of things. But now, you have to obey him. He nodded at Logan. Do what he tells you to do, okay? Be good. Oh, my heart hurts. Finally, the sick man was loaded into the ambulance, and it drove down the road out of the forest. Logan stood there at a loss. He realized that now. He had to decide something urgently. He glanced at Amelie. The girl was agitated, nervously nibbling her finger. "The carriage is strange. The one that took grandfather away," she said. "Why are there no horses?" Logan sighed. He knew that, as a normal person, he should be happy that his sister had been found after all these years. But he also realized that she was. Unfortunately, she was. Not at all the girl his sister could have been, growing up under normal circumstances. In front of him was an adorable but. It was unclear how normal a creature. And he, definitely, now he had to make a lot of important and difficult decisions immediately. Logan didn't consider himself a weak man. He thought that he was ready for many unpleasant surprises of fate, but right now he was at a complete loss. How was he supposed to react to what had happened? Yes, he had found his sister. But it was also true that right now there was a girl standing right next to him. A girl he didn't know, and she needed serious help. "Amelie," he said softly to her. "Do you agree to come with me?" "Where to?" she asked. Now she was tearing flowers, dandelions growing by the fence, and looked like she was going to make a wreath out of them. "Your grandfather told me to take care of you. And I will. But I can't stay with you here in this house. Because I have to go back to the city. I have a job there." "Amelie, do you know what a job is?" "Do you think I'm stupid?" she snorted. "And we're going in a horseless carriage." Yes, Logan nodded, thinking that getting the girl out of this place was a lot easier than he'd thought it would be. But beyond that, and beyond that, it was going to be a lot harder. And so it was. While they were waiting for a cab and Amelie was packing her things, Logan called an acquaintance who was a psychiatrist by profession and worked in a private clinic. Logan briefly outlined the situation to him and told him that his sister really needed help. He also explained that, unfortunately, he didn't see any possibility to put the girl with him in the apartment because it was not clear how she would behave in a new, unfamiliar environment. And it is not an option to take her with him every time leaving the apartment, because Amelie has never seen the city, the outside world outside the forest. "You're telling me some kind of fiction." Sandro reacted violently. "I mean, I believe you, but the case is incredible. Yes, you're right. You cannot put the poor thing with you. But you know, we have here as wards. That is, not the kind in which the violent are kept, of course. But just some clients who are treated for depression, for example, or from obsessive-compulsive disorder in a serious degree. They sometimes prefer to stay with us, because, well, you know, here is a safe space, no worries of the outside world. And the conditions, believe me, is in a 5-star hotel. We have this, and the greenhouse recently built, well, and there is a park. Come on, bring your sister, we'll sort it out." And then Sandro asked if Logan had any of his sister's belongings at home. "Of course," he answered. "Her toys, her dresses. Grandpa didn't want to throw it all away. At our place," he added, "we have the room where Ellen lived. It's still standing like that. Everything's still there. Grandpa and I only cleaned it sometimes." "Good," Sandro responded cheerfully. "You know, we can try to give your sister back the memory of who she is." "Really?" exhaled a shocked Logan. Sandro replied that the chances are there. And even if some of her childhood memories are gone, the contact with the former environment in which she lived, touching old things, all this will help the girl to return, back from the madness in which the old man plunged her. And of course this guy must be dealt with, Sandro added gloomily. It's a maniac. He must not go unpunished. Yes, I understand, Logan sighed, who could barely lift the weight of the only concern he had what to do with his sister now. And what would happen to Dan, he was trying not to think any further right now. Logan led his sister out of the woods into the part of the road where there was a sign for both villages. He had marked it as a reference point when ordering a cab. And what was surprising was that the driver was the same man who had driven him last time, Ben. They got in the car drove off. Logan was afraid that his sister would throw something out on the way, but she only sniffed thoughtfully and was very interested in the upholstery of the seat, checking it with her finger. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Ben asked, looking in the rearview mirror at the passenger and his companion. Yeah, Logan nodded. Naturally, he wasn't going to. He just couldn't tell everything his sister was there, but he said he'd found the owner of the house and, unfortunately, he was in the hospital. And this Logan struggled to find the right words. His pupil. We're going into town. But we're very, very tired, he added with pressure. and we don't want to talk about anything. I see Ben had been working in cabs for a long time and knew perfectly well when a customer didn't want to talk. Though here, of course, curiosity was burning. But Ben was tactfully silent. He only looked with interest at the unusual passenger, when she commented in her peculiar, strange manner on everything she saw outside the window. Logan ordered a cab all the way to the gate of the psychological and mental health clinic where Sandro worked. "Well, happily ever after," Ben said, and then gently slipped Logan a piece of paper with his cell phone number on it. "I realize that I'm poking my nose into my business, but maybe we should call each other, huh? Talk about life. Tell me what's going on over there. How's everything?" "I will," Logan nodded, taking the note. And now came the hard part. Because, in general, although he and the owner of the clinic and Sandro, who met them, tried to act delicately and gently, but Amelie, when she realized that they came not to her grandfather, but to Logan's friends, at whom she would have to stay for a few days. That poor girl was hysterical, and it was very difficult to calm her down. Logan called the hospital to see how Dan was doing. The doctor replied that the old man was put in the general ward, but unfortunately he is very bad. "Prepare for the worst," said the doctors, and Logan understood everything. At work, naturally, they were not thrilled that one of the best employees could not go out again, but Logan simply said that if they didn't like it so much, if they couldn't get into the situation and understand that he had a family emergency, then in that case, why don't they just fire him? The day ended, evening came, night fell on the city. Logan picked up Emily the next morning and told her they were going to visit her grandfather. The girl was thrilled with the news. "What do you think?" Logan asked Sandro, who had already had a chance to talk to Amelie. "The case is difficult, but not hopeless," he replied. "Of course, we still have to look at it, but I think that she has a good consciousness, in the sense that she is intelligent. It seems that this maniac took good care of her education in a sense. I think the main task now is to familiarize her with the fact that the real world, it's not fiction. And I want to tell you right away that it will take a long time for her to adapt to it. It will take a long time." And another thing, Sandro added, "Your sister. Now it will have to do a lot to make her have documents, so that she is no longer considered dead, you know? It will still be necessary to establish kinship by genetic expertise." "You said she's 16, right? Well, you're going to get custody, right?" "Absolutely," Logan nodded. "Okay, do you need any help? Why don't I come with you to the hospital? No offense, but who knows how she'll behave in the city and at the hospital." Logan gratefully accepted the help, and the three of them went to the hospital. Danu was conscious, able to speak, and seemed to be thinking clearly. Amelie rushed to him with a joyful cry, fell on her knees at his bedside, and pressed her cheek against the old man's palm. "Grandfather. Sweet grandfather." Nightmarish and insanely touching scene at the same time. "Do you agree?" whispered Sandro to Logan. Dan, meanwhile, spoke to Amelie. He asked her to pay attention, because he had something very important to tell her. And he said that now, from this day forward and forever, Amelie should trust Logan because he is her closest, dearest person. He will take care of her. Dan apologized and said that he always and more than anything in the world loved Amelie. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I wanted to keep you safe, and so I hurt you. I lied to you." "Grandfather, what are you talking about?" the girl asked, confused. "I don't understand." "You'll understand later," Dan said. He nodded at Logan. "He'll explain everything to you." "Well, that's it. Go. I need to rest." "Logan, stay." Sandro took Amelie out into the corridor. Logan stayed behind. Dan told him that as soon as he felt better, he got his strength back and called his lawyer to the hospital. Yes, despite the fact that Dan led the lifestyle of a hermit and recluse, the means allowed him to have a good lawyer, who in particular helped him to conclude all deals with the sale of antiques. However, the fact that the old man lives not alone, this lawyer knew nothing. And only just yesterday Dan devoted his faithful assistant in the whole story with Amelie. Naturally, he was shocked, but also did not refuse to provide his services further. The lawyer also offered to help him find a lawyer, but Dan declined, saying that it would not be necessary anymore because he would not have much time left. "I dream about my son every night, coming for me, waiting for me. "And my wife is waiting for me there," the old man said. Dan also told Logan that he had long ago prepared a will, according to which everything in the house and antique riches in it, as well as some collection of jewelry. All this goes to his daughter. But she, the poor child, by herself alone, she'll be lost in this world, the old man said with tears in his eyes and clinging to Logan's hand. "Help her." "I won't leave her," Logan said. "She's my sister." And maybe Dan smiled sadly. One day she'll be able to forgive me for everything. And maybe, one day you'll be able to forgive me too." Logan didn't know what to say to that. Forgiveness. To give forgiveness to a man who had behaved like a monster, who had taken his sister away and plunged her into madness on purpose. However, Logan also realized that now, when Dan was on edge, he couldn't be cruel to him. "I've already forgiven you," he said, and squeezed the old man's hand lightly in return. "You have my forgiveness, and believe me, my sister will remember all the good you've done for her." Logan was at a loss. What should he do? He realized that Dan had committed a crime to lock up his found child, to treat her like this all these years, covering everything with love. But on the other hand, no. Logan realized that he was not able to think more about it right now. After all, right now Dan was lying in the hospital. He was no danger to Elena right now. Ellen. Logan had dedicated a few hours that very day to chatting with the girl. She was really very smart, although her ideas about the world around her were strange. And she was also surprisingly easy to accept the fact that her grandfather had admitted to her that he had lied. She only asked Logan what Grandpa had lied about, and he tried to carefully explain. He was also happy that Amelie liked so far in the clinic, through the efforts of Sandro, who connected to this extraordinary story and the owner of the clinic. The girl lived in a separate room, which was really very similar to home cozy conditions. It turned out that Amelie was very fond of reading. Logan tried to explain to her what a phone, TV, showed her a video on a smartphone. And in general, he expected that she would be shocked, would be delighted, because it's such a fantasy for her usual picture of the world. But Amelie, after a little attention to this, returned to the books and also took up a sketchbook and watercolors. Interesting, but boring. It's not real, that's what she said. And then, Logan suddenly realized that in the midst of all the important things he had been doing, he had forgotten that there were other people who needed his help, Anastasia and little Kate. He decided to go to the village and visit them. "You'll take a cab for the whole paycheck." Sandro joked and suggested that tomorrow was his day off and he could take him to the village. And while driving, of course, did not do without talking. "So she is pretty," said with a grin Sandro. "So you like her? Were you even listening to me?" Logan frowned. "I didn't say anything like that." "That's right. You didn't say it directly," he nodded, now with a grin that was not teasing but condescending. "But the way you said it, it speaks volumes, you know." "Can't you be serious?" Logan leaned his head back against the seat with a groan. "I've got a headache." Sandro was a good friend. He knew how to keep his jokes in moderation. And so the rest of the trip was silent. So Logan even managed to take a nap. Where here his friend poked him lightly in the shoulder as the car slowed at the gate. "No one," Logan said disappointedly after a moment, as no one answered their call. "Wait," Sandro said. "I heard something. Come on over here." "Hey, you can't do that." Logan hissed at his friend, who without permission of the absent owners opened the gate and entered the yard. But Sandro confidently stomped toward the house. "Quiet," raised his hand. "Do you hear?" Logan obediently tried to catch any sound. Silence. Although, he heard it. A thin, muffled sound, reminiscent of a trapped animal crying. He knocked on the door and called his name. The strange sound from the other side intensified. "Wait, we have to check," Sandro, going around the house, looked through the window. And after a moment he recoiled, swearing, and then he just took the glass and broke the window. Then, wrapping his hand around the sleeve of his jacket, he ran it inside and unlocked the window sash. And now Logan was totally okay with that action because he saw what was inside the house too. There in the room were both of them, mother and daughter. Little Kate was sitting, crawling into the far corner of the room, under the table. The girl was trembling and seemed so frightened that she could not even cry, let alone call for help, and only made such pitiful sounds. Anastasia was lying next to her on the floor. She was lying on her side, curled up in a ball, as if she wanted to defend herself. And she was unconscious, and her face, hands, everything was in the traces of an unequal fight. The third person in the room was a huge man sprawled on the couch. He had obviously fallen asleep from alcohol. There were bottles lying near him. And right now his mouth opened, and he let out a long, crackling snore. Anastasia. Sandro rushed to the young woman, checked her pulse. Alive. Logan crouched on the floor and spoke softly to Kate, trying to convey to her that there was nothing to be afraid of and it was safe to come out. Anastasia started to come to her senses, moaning softly, then shrieked, startled. Anastasia. It's all right. Don't be afraid. Everything will be all right now, Sandro said. Anastasia looked around frantically, then, from the last strength, rushed to her daughter, who decided to finally get out from under the table and hugged her, pressed her against herself and cried. Help. Please save me. I can't take it anymore. What? Who are you? A huge man, Nastia's husband, started to wake up. Anastasia, seeing this, cried out in horror and then froze, because Sandro, without much conversation, with one powerful blow to the face, sent this guy into unconsciousness. Not very right, perhaps, but I don't want him to stop us from leaving, said Sandro, losing his knuckles. His hand hurt from such a blow. Acting very gently, carefully, the friends led Anastasia and Katya out of the house. Sandro thoughtfully reminded them that they had to bring the documents with them. The decision was made instantly to take the woman and the child to the apartment with Logan, because they would have nowhere else to go. Thank you, Anastasia said quietly. You saved us. We really won't be in your way much longer. You're not in the way, Logan sighed. The main thing is not to interfere with your husband, said Sandro. You're not going to forgive him. You're not thinking of going back to him, are you? He asked. And when Anastasia shook her head in the negative, he continued. We'll be there soon. But before we go home, you need to go to the hospital, of course. In the meantime, tell us what happened. And Anastasia spoke. The night before, her husband had come home. He had been fired from another job without paying anything, and he had come back very angry. Anastasia took the risk of talking to him about how things couldn't go on like this, and said she wanted a divorce. Then the man raged at her, reminded her that they were husband and wife, and said that he would teach her obedience, that he would put them both, mother and daughter, on a leash like unruly dogs, and that they would never leave the house again, not even to go to the yard. He threw himself at his daughter. Then Anastasia, who was trying to protect the little girl, got the brunt of it. Then the husband took to alcohol, after which he fell asleep for a while. Logan listened to the story in steely silence, and it was only by the change in his gaze that he could guess what he was thinking. He was about to say something, but his phone rang. Logan took the call, and for the second time his face changed. Dan's dead, he said in a low voice. Those had been difficult, eventful days for Logan, days that had turned many ideas about his own life upside down, in which that very life had taken the most bizarre, disturbing, demanding forms. He was the only one who could take care of seeing Dan off in a dignified manner. He had 1,000 things he needed to do urgently in order to get custody of his sister, as well as to ensure that she received full treatment and support from qualified professionals. And then there was Anastasia and Kate. Logan had put them in his apartment as he had planned, for what he thought would be the first time. And though he hadn't planned it, it just so happened that he had told Anastasia about his sister and the recent events surrounding her. That's terrible. What you've been through, Anastasia responded with genuine sympathy. But now, everything's all right, isn't it? I wish I could believe that, Logan replied. I do believe that. Theoretically, Anastasia and Kate could have moved into a rented apartment soon. The charity where Logan worked had responded to the story and was willing to help. But he'd refused. And he had a hard time explaining it all to himself, but he was better off that they stayed with him. There was plenty of room in the 4-room apartment. Anastasia was naturally very timid at first and asked permission for every step. But a little later, at some point it became a regular thing she would get up early and cook breakfast for Logan, and though he repeatedly said it wasn't worth the trouble, she would do it. As for little Kate, she, unlike her mother, settled down at the new place much faster. And although in general Katenka was a modest and well-mannered girl, but at the same time she was very curious and asked a lot of questions about everything that surrounded her. For example, she was very interested in all kinds of sea stories related to a large collection of shells, which were collected from all over the world by Logan's great-grandfather. And then it happened, when the divorce proceedings were already in full swing. Logan offered to take Nastia to a good clinic for an examination. She refused, but he talked her into it. And according to the results of the examination, it became known that the young woman's leg can be saved, you just need to operate. "I don't have and won't have that kind of money," said Anastasia. "Don't worry about that," Logan said. But she was against it, saying she couldn't accept it. For her daughter's sake. For Kate's sake, Logan made the strongest argument, and Anastasia had to agree that the baby needed a healthy mom. And even a little later, Nastia's deadbeat ex-husband was stripped of his parental rights. And besides, Logan and Sandro had a serious talk with him, explaining that he should never go near Nastia and her daughter again, otherwise he would be in serious trouble. Logan's sister was still in the clinic. She was having a hard time over the loss of her grandfather. It made it difficult to get the girl back to the real world. But gradually she was getting better, and according to Sandro, very soon Ellen could move in with Logan. As for the inheritance from Dan, it was going to be huge, even by rough estimates, because Dan, as it turned out, collected very rare and expensive antiques. The surgery on Anastasia's leg was successful, and soon the doctors were talking about the fact that she would probably be able to walk normally. "Thank you," Anastasia thanked Logan very often, but this time she was especially excited. "It's all thanks to you. You just saved us." "We've talked about this before," Logan said jokingly. He had been thinking about Nastia a lot lately. It was strange, but at some point he realized that he had gotten used to her. And her daughter, too. And now it was hard for him to imagine that one day, or rather soon, they both might leave him. "Anastasia," Logan said softly to her, "we need to talk." "About what?" the young woman asked excitedly. The conversation took place in the late afternoon. Anastasia stood on the balcony of the apartment and watched the lights of street lamps, the rare glowing windows of houses, the cars driving along the many roads of the city in the early fall night. "About us," Logan said quietly. "About us?" she echoed. "Yes," he said, and continued. He told her about his sudden feelings, about how he'd never felt anything like this before. He also said that all his help, that in no way makes Anastasia his responsibility, and even if she turns down his offer, he's still a friend to her and her daughter. "I certainly should have done it differently," Logan said, looking into Nastia's eyes, which seemed to reflect the stars. "Buy a ring, arrange everything romantically. But I just somehow spontaneously decided everything finally. I want you to be my wife." Anastasia smiled. A single tear rolled from her eyes, no more. And then she threw herself around Logan's neck and hugged him tightly. "I love you," he said. "I love you, too," she whispered back. "Do you think I'll be able to dance at our wedding?" The wedding took place in the spring, in a garden full of blossoming trees. And Anastasia wore not only a beautiful dress, but also high-heeled shoes that she could dance in, just as she had dreamed. And on this day, she and Logan felt the happiest. They were happy, but they didn't know yet what was ahead of them. They didn't know that in a year there would be a new addition to their family. Kate would have a baby brother, who would be named George. They did not know that in 4 years Sandro, who had become a close family friend, would decide to marry Helene, who would give him her consent. Nor did they know that Helene would fully recover her mental health and decide to continue her family's work and become a talented historian, dedicating herself to the theme of ancient Egypt. All this was on the marvelous wedding day, only the future hidden from them. But the fact that in this future and in many other years they would be happy was already clear.